Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I was driving west out of Alice Springs on the Stewart Highway, headed for Elara where I worked. It was a dry, hot afternoon, probably close to 40 degrees, that kind of heat that makes the bitumen shimmer and stretch like a mirage in front of you. I was in the passenger seat, legs sticking to the vinyl, occasionally wiping my neck with a damp towel I'd kept in the esky. There were 3 of us in the car, me and 2 co-workers, heading back after a supply run. We'd left early enough to beat the worst of the sun, but it was no use. Out here, the heat never really lets up. It just shifts from bad to worse and back again. The drive from Alice to Elara takes about 4 hours if you're not rushing. It's a long, empty road cutting straight through the red center. Once you pass the last few buildings on the outskirts of Alice Springs, there's nothing for miles. The scenery doesn't change much. Red dirt, scrubby spinifex, low-growing desert oaks that look more dead than alive. Every now and then you pass a roadhouse, a cluster of fuel pumps, a weather-beaten sign, maybe a small diner with some dusty chairs out front. Most of them don't even have people hanging around. Just the sound of flies and the heat bouncing off every surface. You don't pass many cars on that stretch. Maybe one every 30 or 40 minutes. And even then it's usually a tour bus or a dusty Uda heading the other way. Most people underestimate how vast and empty Central Australia is until they find themselves alone out there. Nothing but dry air and that thick silence you only get in the outback. That day was no different. The road stretched ahead in a straight line, and we hadn't seen another vehicle in maybe 20 minutes. We were somewhere between the Curtin Springs turnoff and Mount Ebenezer when we saw something strange on the side of the road. At first, it just looked like a dark smudge against the red dust, but as we got closer, I saw it clearly. A handbag. A woman's handbag, just sitting there on the gravel shoulder. Next to it was a white plastic shopping bag, the kind you get from a supermarket, half open. Something about it made us slow down and stop. We pulled over, engine idling, the aircon coughing out tired breath. I opened the door and stepped out, and the heat hit me like a wall. The cicadas were screaming. The road was so hot I could feel it through the soles of my boots. I walked around to the shoulder and looked down at the items. The handbag was simple dark brown, with short handles and a zipper along the top. It didn't look old or worn. In fact, it looked like it had just been placed there. Next to it, the white plastic bag had a pack of carrots inside. I could see them clearly through the thin plastic, small, peeled baby carrots in one of those resealable bags. When I touched the plastic, it was cool. Still chilled, like it had come from a fridge just minutes ago. Beside that was a water bottle, clear and half full, with condensation still on the outside. Cold. In this heat. That was the part that really made my stomach twist. Nothing stays cold out here unless it's straight from a fridge or an esky. And yet, here it was cold to the touch, with no one in sight. We stood there for a while, just looking around. The land was open, flat in all directions. Low brush here and there, but nothing tall enough to hide behind. You could see for hundreds of meters in every direction, and there was no one. No movement. No noise except for the flies and the wind brushing over the dry ground. There weren't any tracks. At least not that we could see. The red dirt had been disturbed a little around where the bag sat, but it could have been from wind, or maybe the movement of a small animal. There were no tire marks leading into the bush, no footprints heading off in either direction. It didn't make sense. The only other explanation was that someone had gotten out of a car, placed the bag and bottle there, and then, walked off into the bush? There was no shade out there. No sign of a breakdown, no abandoned vehicle. It didn't add up. We called out. Nothing. Waited. Looked around some more. Still nothing. The silence out there is different. It presses down on you, makes you feel like you're being watched, even though there's nowhere for anyone to hide. The heat was starting to sting my scalp, so I stepped back into the car and grabbed a hat. I drank some water from our esky and looked at the others. We all felt it, that low, unsettled feeling in our guts. Something was wrong. We didn't know what to do. You don't come across something like that often. A handbag and cold food just lying on the side of a highway in the middle of nowhere. If it had been just a bag, maybe we'd have thought someone forgot it, left it behind while they stopped to take a photo. But cold carrots, a cold water bottle, That meant someone had been there recently. Very recently. And they were no longer there. We checked the bag. It was empty. No wallet, no phone, no keys, not even a receipt. Just the bag. Clean inside, like it had never been used. That made the whole thing even stranger. Why carry around an empty handbag? And why leave it on the road? Maybe someone had dumped it, but who drives all the way out there just to dump a handbag and a bag of carrots? We didn't want to just leave it, so we took the bag, the carrots, and the bottle, put them carefully in the boot, and kept driving toward Yulara. No one said much for a while. We were all turning it over in our heads, trying to find a reasonable explanation. A car broken down, and someone walking for help. But there were no footprints, no tire marks, no shade to wait under. If someone had been walking, we would have seen them. It was that kind of landscape. Wide open. And the nearest roadhouse in either direction was at least half an hour's drive away. When we finally got to Yulara, we drove straight to the police station. It's not a big place, just a few rooms, mostly used for handling tourists getting lost or drunk. We handed over the bag, explained where we found it, and gave them the exact location. They asked a few questions, but nothing too serious. Said they'd look into it. We left our contact details in case they needed a statement, or if anything came up. We thought maybe we'd hear something. A missing persons report. A follow-up. But days passed and no one called. We went back to work. Tour groups, hotel guests, the usual busyness of the Yulara resort. But I kept thinking about that stretch of road, that cold water bottle, and the bag sitting there like it was placed on display. I kept imagining someone standing there, alone, just minutes before we arrived. Where had they gone? A week later, I went back to the police station to ask if they'd found anything. The officer on duty checked the logs. Nothing. No missing persons. No reports of abandoned vehicles. Nothing suspicious. It was as if it never happened. After that, it stayed with me for a while. I'd think about it when I was driving that road again, watching the same stretch of nothing roll past. Sometimes I'd find myself glancing at the shoulders, half expecting to see another bag, another strange sign that someone had been there and vanished. But I never saw anything like it again. We never found out who it belonged to. Never found out how those carrots and that water stayed cold in the middle of nowhere, or why someone would leave them there without a trace. Maybe someone did break down and was picked up by a passing truck. Maybe they were too rattled to report it. Maybe they left the bag behind on purpose. I don't know. None of it made sense. What still gets to me is how fresh everything was. The condensation on the bottle. The cold vegetables. That means whoever left them had to be there within minutes of us arriving. 5, 10 at most. And we saw no one. Nothing. Not a sound, not a figure in the distance. Nothing. Eventually, I stopped checking in with the police. It was clear there wasn't going to be an answer. Life moved on, as it does. But even now, whenever I drive that road, I still look. Still wonder if we passed someone that day without knowing it. If they were standing just over a rise, or crouched low behind a bush watching us. I guess we'll never know. And that's the part that really stays with you. Not the bag or the carrots or the bottle, but the silence. That dry, heavy silence. Like the land itself swallowed up whatever happened there and chose not to give it back. I was living in the middle of nowhere back then. The kind of place where the nearest neighbor was a mile away and the closest store was a 20-minute drive. The roads around my house were all winding, hilly, and narrow, with dense tree cover that seemed to close in on you no matter which direction you were going. It wasn't much of a problem in the daytime, but at night, everything felt different. Everything felt a little off. You could hear the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. The kind of sound that made you wonder if someone, or something, was lurking just out of sight. But like most people who lived there, I didn't think too much about it. It was home, and you got used to it. That night, I had just left a friend's house after hanging out for a bit. Nothing unusual about that. I had driven that road hundreds of times, maybe even thousands. The moon was unusually bright that night, lighting up the road ahead of me like a flashlight pointed right at it. I remember feeling comfortable with how easy the drive usually was, even though the road was so desolate. The lack of traffic at that hour was nice, even though it felt like I was driving through an endless tunnel of trees. I was just cruising along, minding my own business, when something caught my eye. It was far up ahead, right where the road curved. At first, I thought it might be headlights from another car, but there was something strange about the way the lights glowed. It wasn't a normal white or yellow car headlight. These were a deep purple, the kind of color you'd see from a blacklight in a party store or some weird, overly decorated custom truck. But the lights were high up, almost too high to be attached to a vehicle at first glance. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but they seemed elevated, way higher than your average car would sit, almost like they were mounted on something much taller than a truck. I slowed down a bit, trying to figure out what I was seeing. My headlights shone on the road ahead, but the purple lights were far enough away that it was hard to make out what kind of vehicle they could be attached to. I didn't think it was an animal or anything like that. It was too bright, too strange for that. I'd heard of eccentric backwoods folks who decked out their cars in weird, flashy lights, but this felt different. I couldn't figure out why anyone would have lights set up like that, though. I kept my distance, thinking I'd figure it out as I got closer. For the next few seconds, I just kept my eyes on those purple lights, keeping a safe distance as we approached a stop sign. The car ahead of me came to a stop, its brakes squealing slightly before it took off like a rocket. Without thinking, I followed it. Part of me was curious. What the hell were those lights? Where were they coming from, and how were they so high up? Another part of me just didn't want to be left behind on a lonely, dark road in the middle of nowhere. The road from the stop sign curved upwards, winding gently, and the trees started to get denser on either side. It was one of those stretches where the trees feel like they could swallow the road whole, leaving you in the shadow of the canopy, even on the brightest of nights. I was speeding up a bit now, trying to keep up with whatever the hell this thing was in front of me. I could still see the purple lights ahead, but as we crested the hill, they disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. I'm not one to get scared easily, but I felt my heart pick up pace. This was a straight stretch of road now. The path should have been clear ahead. The trees were still dense along the sides, but I knew the road. There wasn't any place for the lights to go. The vehicle in front of me had just gone over the hill, and I had a clear line of sight as we headed downhill into a small dip with a little curve to the right. The straight stretch of road seemed like it would go on for a while, but those purple lights, they were just gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes for a second, thinking maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe the road was curving so much that I had lost sight of them in the trees. But when I came out of the curve, I didn't see anything. There was nothing on the road ahead of me, no headlights, no purple glow, nothing. I slowed down as I came into the next stretch, glancing around. There were two driveways on my left and right, one leading into an open field, and the other to a house. Both driveways were wide and clear, nothing blocking them. If there had been a vehicle there, I should have been able to see it. I should have been able to spot the source of those strange lights, but there was nothing. My first thought was that maybe I had missed something. Maybe the car in front of me had turned off into one of the driveways when I lost sight of it. But that didn't make sense. The road was too straight, the driveways too open. If a vehicle had pulled in there, I would have seen it. I looked again, craning my neck, but there was no sign of the purple lights. No car, no truck, no nothing. Just the bright moonlight casting long shadows across the empty road. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up a little. It didn't add up. It didn't make any sense. The road ahead was straight, open, and empty. Where had the lights gone? They didn't just vanish into thin air. I slowed to a crawl, turning my head, looking over my shoulder, trying to figure out what happened. I thought maybe I was just tired, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The way those lights had appeared so suddenly, high up like that, and then just disappeared without a trace. There wasn't any logical explanation that I could come up with at that moment. I kept driving, trying to shake the weirdness of the moment out of my mind, but I couldn't. The rest of the drive home felt different after that, like the trees were just a little bit closer to the road, the shadows a little darker. Even though I knew the road like the back of my hand, something about that stretch felt unfamiliar, and I couldn't stop replaying those lights in my mind. What were they? Was it just some trick of the moonlight, or had I really seen something strange? I still think about that night every now and then. I've tried to convince myself that it was just some weird optical illusion, or maybe even someone with a custom truck that had unusually high-mounted lights. But there's no logical explanation for how those lights could have disappeared so quickly. The road was too open, too straight. No one could have just disappeared into thin air like that, not without a trace. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't some wild animal, but to this day, I still don't know what I saw that night. Whatever it was, It didn't feel like a normal occurrence. It didn't feel right. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But I'll never forget that strange purple light, vanishing as fast as it appeared. The first time I saw the farmhouse, it looked like something out of a painting. Beautiful, quiet, surrounded by wide open space. It was late spring, the fields were full of tall grass, and the wind moved through them like waves. Trees lined the property in uneven clusters, and there was a gravel road that ran from the main highway through a set of old wooden gates up to the house. I'd agreed to house sit for a family friend who was going on a 2-week vacation with their kids. They had a good bit of land, some livestock, mostly sheep, a few chickens, and a couple of pets, a golden retriever and a barn cat that I only ever saw in passing. The place was 4 miles from the nearest town, and while I wouldn't call myself a city person, I wasn't used to being that far out in the middle of nowhere either. The first day I arrived, everything felt fine. The sun was out. The dog was excited to have company. I went through the list of instructions they'd left me. Feed the animals in the morning, check the water tanks, keep the doors locked at night, and bring in the mail from the box by the road. There was nothing unusual about any of it. I stocked the fridge with groceries I'd brought from town, figured out the TV setup, and walked around to familiarize myself with the place. The barn sat about 100 yards behind the house, and from the back porch I could see most of the field and the trees that bordered it. There was no one else around. Just me, the animals, and a lot of space. The first night was uneventful, if a little eerie. Once the sun went down, the landscape changed. It wasn't the same peaceful kind of quiet. It was too quiet. I hadn't realized how much I relied on the distant hum of traffic or the buzz of streetlights back home. Out there, at night, it was so dark you couldn't see past the windows. And the silence made every sound inside the house feel louder than it should have been. The click of the fridge motor, the creak of floorboards, even my own breathing. I left a few lights on and eventually fell asleep on the couch with the dog curled up on the rug nearby. The second night, I noticed the wind. It came in steady gusts that rattled the shutters and made the trees outside sway and groan. Nothing scary happened, but the mood of the house felt different than during the day. Shadows stretched longer, and the old wooden floor made noises even when I wasn't walking on it. I kept reminding myself that it was just an old house settling. I tried to distract myself with a movie, something light, and ended up watching a few episodes of a cooking show until I was too tired to care anymore. By the third night, I had started to settle into a bit of a routine. Feed the animals in the morning, check the barn, let the dog out in the afternoon, cook dinner, watch something on TV, then sleep. That night I decided to stay up a bit later. I was watching some old horror movie on one of the streaming services. Not one of the really scary ones, just the kind with predictable jump scares and a cheesy soundtrack. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I remember because I'd checked my phone after the movie ended, trying to decide if I had time for one more before bed. That's when the doorbell rang. It took me a second to register it. The sound was sharp and out of place, especially that late. The doorbell was one of those older style chimes, the kind you don't really hear anymore, and it echoed through the quiet house. The dog perked up immediately, ears raised, and let out a low bark. I paused the TV and got up slowly, not really sure what I was expecting. The front door had a small window, and to the right of it was the security system's monitor that showed the CCTV feed. The driveway was long and open. You couldn't really come up to the house without being seen. I checked the peephole first, but there was no one there. Then I looked at the monitor. The porch was empty. The driveway was empty. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't seen headlights, nothing. I stood there for a while, thinking maybe it was a prank or a delivery, though who delivers packages that late in the middle of nowhere? Eventually I shook it off, figured it had to be some kind of electrical glitch, or maybe I'd imagined it. I locked the door again and went back to the living room. 10 minutes later, it happened again. Same loud chime. The dog barked louder this time, jumping to its feet. Again I walked to the door. Again nothing. No movement. No sound outside. No car. Just the wind blowing through the grass and the faint creak of the front steps as they shifted with the breeze. I checked the cameras again. Still nothing. I felt my stomach tighten in that slow, creeping way that isn't full-on panic, but is definitely the start of it. It happened 2 more times after that. Once while I was watching the camera feed live. The doorbell rang, and there was still nothing on the screen. It didn't make any sense. There wasn't even a shadow, no sign of movement at all. The porch light stayed steady, the wind blew a little stronger, but there was absolutely nobody there. I didn't bother turning the movie back on. I walked through the house locking every door and window twice over, even the ones I hadn't opened. I turned on the light in the hallway and finally went into the master bedroom, locked that door too, and stayed in bed with the dog curled up next to me. I barely slept, and every sound the house made, from the groan of the roof beams to the tapping of a tree branch against the siding, kept me wide awake. By morning, I was exhausted. Daylight always changes things. Everything seemed normal again. The animals were fine, the sky was clear, and even the dog didn't seem bothered. I checked the doorbell out of curiosity, but I didn't see anything wrong with it. It looked old but functional. I even rang it myself to test it. The chime echoed through the house just like it had the night before. I opened the door, walked out onto the porch, looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. It felt like the kind of thing I could laugh off once I was back in town, but at the time it still sat in the back of my mind like a rock in my shoe. The fourth night, I didn't feel like being alone with my thoughts. I'd fed the animals earlier than usual, brought in the mail, even cleaned up the kitchen just to keep busy. I didn't want to think about the doorbell. I opened a bottle of wine I'd brought, had a couple of glasses, and sat on the couch with the dog by my feet. I found a ghost hunter show online and let it play. Part of me figured if the place was going to be weird, I might as well lean into it. The show was full of dramatic voiceovers, night vision footage, and whispered theories about spirits and haunted history. It was kind of dumb, but also distracting. I kept drinking. Not enough to get drunk, but just enough to feel a little braver than I had the night before. By the time I turned off the TV, it was nearly 1 a.m. The dog was already asleep on the rug, and the wind outside had died down. The house felt quiet, too quiet again. I got up, stretched, turned off the light in the living room, and as soon as I did, I heard it. The sound of running water. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a drip. It was full-on flow, like a faucet turned on all the way. At first I thought maybe the pipes were making noise, or maybe the washing machine had been left running. But as I followed the sound, it led me straight to the main bathroom. The door was half open, and sure enough, the shower was on. I stopped in the doorway, staring at it. The curtain was pulled halfway back and water was blasting from the shower head, bouncing off the tiled floor of the tub. Steam had already started to fill the room. I hadn't used that shower at all during my stay. I'd been using the one in the ensuite bathroom off the master bedroom. I knew for a fact it hadn't been running earlier in the day. I reached in and turned the knob off. The water stopped immediately. The room was warm from the steam, and I stood there for a moment just trying to process it. It didn't make any sense. Even if it had been leaking, it wouldn't have come on full blast like that. And I didn't remember anything in the instructions about plumbing problems. Still, I didn't hear any other noises. No pipes clanking, no odd clicks from the water heater. Just silence again. I left the light on in the hallway that night. I didn't lock myself in the bedroom again, but I kept the dog close. Slept with the covers pulled up high, even though the room was warm. The next morning was my last one at the farmhouse. I was up early, packed my things, and did one last round feeding the animals. I double-checked the locks, left a note for the family thanking them, and drove the long gravel driveway out to the main road. Later that week, I met up with some friends and told them what had happened. The doorbell ringing, the shower turning on by itself, the general weirdness. One of them laughed and said the doorbell always does that on windy nights. Apparently it's got a loose connection or something, and the chime can be triggered by vibration. Another friend, who knew the family better, said the main shower acts up all the time. Something about old plumbing and a faulty valve that randomly kicks in and starts the flow again, especially after the hot water's been used a lot. They weren't surprised at all, but I was. Because even though there was a rational explanation for everything, the way it felt at the time, being alone, far from town, with nothing but fields and woods around me, it was different. It didn't feel like normal, explainable things. It felt off, unsettling, not supernatural, not haunted, but deeply uncomfortable in a way that only isolation can be. I've house sat for other people since then, but I've never felt that same tension in a place. I still think about it sometimes. About the doorbell ringing in a house with no visitors. About water running from a shower I never used. About being alone with just my own thoughts and the sounds of an old house in the wind. It reminds me that sometimes, even when there's a clear answer, the feeling of fear doesn't just disappear. It stays with you, tucked away, quiet, waiting. Just like that house at night. I was either 14 or 15 when this happened. It's hard to remember the exact age now, but I know I was just young enough to think I was invincible and old enough to start realizing I wasn't. I grew up on the edge of a big city in southwest Canada, one of those newer suburban neighborhoods that kind of felt like they were dropped right on top of farmland and forest. If you drove 2 minutes from my friend's house, you'd be out in the middle of open fields or deep wooded areas. It was the kind of place that felt a little too quiet during the day and way too open at night. Back then, I didn't think too much of it. It was just where we lived. The neighborhood was still under development, so a lot of the houses were brand new, and there were always construction sites everywhere. You could smell sawdust and concrete most days when the wind shifted right. We had the kind of freedom that came with living in a place that wasn't quite finished yet. Fewer eyes watching, fewer rules, and so we got into a lot of things we probably shouldn't have. I had 2 best friends at the time, the kind of friends you basically lived at each other's houses with. We were a bit wild, and by wild, I mean just immature and reckless. One of my friends, let's call him M, had a house that sort of became the hub for all of our meetups. His mom worked night shifts and was hardly ever home, and she never knew when we stayed over. So we basically had free reign of the place. Most weekends, we'd either crash there or stay out all night, doing whatever came to mind. We didn't do drugs or anything crazy like that, but we were still stupid in our own way. We'd light firecrackers, break old bottles we found, throw things at road signs, walk for miles through the fields just for the hell of it. I remember one time we tried to build a fort out of scrap wood we dragged from the construction areas. It was never about doing anything productive. We just wanted to burn off whatever energy teenage boys had running through them in the dead of night. The later it got, the more daring we got. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., it didn't matter. It almost felt like a challenge to stay out later than the night before. That one night, the one that stuck with me for years, started off like any other. It was a Friday, and I was sleeping over at M's place. Our third friend was there too. We didn't really have a plan. It was late, close to 1 in the morning, maybe later. We had already burned through some firecrackers, smashed a few old bottles behind one of the houses still under construction, and were walking around in this big empty field that stretched out behind the houses. The air had that cold, dry feeling you only get in the middle of the night when you're just standing still, not talking much. You could hear the hum of the streetlights back near the houses and the occasional rustle from the woods nearby. But mostly it was just quiet. We were messing around near the edge of the field when one of us, I can't remember who, got the idea to sneak into the nearby construction site. It was just off to the left of the field. You could see the frames of what looked like future townhouses, or maybe small apartment buildings, all lined up in rows. Most of them didn't even have walls up yet, just beams, piles of drywall, stacks of concrete slabs. No lights, no security. It looked like the workers had just dropped everything and left when the day ended. It felt like the kind of place we shouldn't be in, which of course made us want to go in even more. We snuck in quietly, half laughing, trying not to trip over random wood planks or get caught on fencing. Once we were inside, something changed. It wasn't funny anymore. Not really scary yet, just weird. Empty. Cold. Even though it wasn't winter, the air inside the site felt colder than outside. Maybe it was just the way the wind cut through the open beams, or the concrete radiating the chill from the day. I don't know, but we stopped laughing. We spread out a little, checking things out. There were ladders leaned against half-built frames, empty toolboxes, plastic wrap whipping around in the breeze. It all looked abandoned, like people had just vanished in the middle of their work. I remember climbing up onto a wooden platform that was supposed to be the second floor of something, looking out at the rows of frames and the dark tree line beyond the field. It was quiet, that heavy kind of quiet that starts to feel loud if you stand still too long. I looked down and saw my friends walking slowly around below, their silhouettes just barely lit by the faint glow from the nearest street lamp way off in the distance. We weren't talking anymore. None of us said anything, but we all must have felt the same thing, like we were being watched. Not by anyone in particular, just by the dark itself. The buildings felt taller in the silence, the shadows sharper, the shapes less familiar. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A scream. Not some weird animal noise, or someone yelling in the distance. It was a full, human scream. A woman. It cut through the air like someone had turned the volume all the way up. It came from somewhere close, not inside the construction site, but not far from it either. Maybe from the wooded area, right past the last row of beams. We froze. I remember every muscle in my body locking up at once. It wasn't just that we heard a scream. It was the kind of scream you don't forget. Panic, pain, fear. The kind of scream that shoots adrenaline into your chest before your brain even catches up. Before we could even process it, there were two loud bangs. Gunshots. Not fireworks, not something falling, gunshots. Close enough that I could feel them in my chest. Two sharp cracks that echoed through the night, loud and quick. And then nothing. No more screaming. No rustling. No footsteps. Just dead silence again. We didn't say a word to each other. We just ran. We sprinted out of that site, hurdling over wood piles and ducking under beams, crashing through the opening in the fence and tearing across the field like we were being chased. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop. None of us looked back. We didn't need to. Whatever that was, it was enough to burn itself into our heads. We didn't stop until we were inside M's house, panting, shaking, trying to catch our breath. I remember standing in his kitchen, leaning over the counter with my hands on the cold surface, trying not to throw up. My heart was going so fast it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. We didn't talk much. Maybe a few mumbled sentences like, "What the hell was that?" or "Did you hear it too?" But nothing real. We ended up crashing on the floor of M's room, fully clothed, not even bothering to pretend we were okay. I don't think any of us slept. We just laid there, eyes wide, ears on high alert, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing else did. The next morning, it felt like maybe we had imagined it. Or at least, that's what we told ourselves. Maybe it wasn't gunshots. Maybe the scream was something else. We didn't talk about it much in the weeks that followed. Not because we didn't care, but because none of us wanted to be the one to admit it was real. We just pushed it aside like it was another one of our stupid nighttime adventures that got a little out of hand. But then something else happened. About a month later, right on M's street, literally a house or two down from his, there was a murder. A man was shot in the middle of the night. Right there, in what was supposed to be one of the safest new neighborhoods in the city. It was in the local news. Police cars, yellow tape, interviews with neighbors. We watched it all unfold from M's window. He was quiet for days after that. We all were. It was too close. Not just the physical distance, but the connection. We had been maybe 300 feet from a scream and gunshots in the middle of a night just weeks earlier. And now someone had been killed practically in front of our friend's house. We never found out what happened to the woman we heard screaming. There were no news reports, no police presence near the construction site, no one asking questions in the days after. It was like it had never happened, which made it worse. The silence that followed was heavier than the scream itself. It made us wonder, did we hear something that no one else did? Or did we just get away before anyone could stop us? Sometimes I think about what could have happened if we had stayed in that site a few minutes longer. If we had gone toward the sound instead of away from it. If whoever fired those shots had seen us. We were loud, reckless, not careful. We never thought we were in danger until we were running from it. And even now, years later, I still get that cold feeling in my stomach when I think about that scream. The way it started sharp and sudden and was just cut off, like someone pressed mute on a remote. We had a lot of stories from those years. Times we scared ourselves silly, or got chased off by security guards, or nearly broke a leg trying to climb something we shouldn't have. But none of those stories stuck like this one. Because this wasn't a joke. It wasn't some creepy noise in the woods, or an old man yelling at us. It was real. Someone screamed. Someone fired a gun. And then it was silent. And we'll never really know what we witnessed that night. But I'll never forget it. I was 13 at the time, and it was the kind of late afternoon where the sun was just beginning to set, casting a long shadow across everything. I was with a couple of friends, just goofing around in this pretty quiet, mostly wooded neighborhood near the edge of town. We didn't have any real plan, just wanted to kill time before heading back home. But it was one of those days where the air felt thick, almost like something was off, though we didn't say anything about it. It was one of those summer days where it felt like you could do anything, but also like everything was a little too still. We were walking along the streets, cutting through back alleys that were pretty overgrown, as usual, when we noticed the car. It wasn't anything special, just a dark sedan. But what was weird was that it had been driving slow, and it was always just a little too close to us, no matter how many turns we took. At first, we thought it was just a coincidence, but after a few more twists and turns, we couldn't shake the feeling that it was following us. The hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up, but I didn't say anything. My friends didn't seem to notice yet, but I was starting to get a little nervous. It was too quiet around here. We'd seen no one else, and there wasn't much traffic. Then we got this weird idea to sit on the steps of an old funeral home, or, more specifically, a crematorium. We'd always known it had been shut down and relocated a while ago. Nobody ever came around there, so we figured it'd be a good spot to rest and chat. Maybe we'd cool down for a bit. The steps were cold under my legs, and the stone felt strangely smooth, like it had been worn down over years. I remember thinking how odd it was that a building like that sat there, abandoned but still standing, with no one around to care what we did. It wasn't like it was a place where people gathered anymore. The neighborhood felt empty, even though there were houses all around. But the moment we sat down, I had this strange feeling. That car had parked just down the street, maybe 20 feet away. I don't know how I noticed it, but I did. Its engine was off now, but the headlights were still on. The weird part was, no one had gotten out of the car. The car was just sitting there, idling, and it felt wrong. The street was deserted except for us, and even though I couldn't see the driver's face, something in the stillness of it all made my stomach turn. We were all silent for a while, just looking at the car. We didn't talk, just exchanged glances. It was like we all felt it at the same time, a kind of chill running down our spines. I don't know why we stayed there for as long as we did. Maybe it was that weird instinct, like we were trying to figure out what was going to happen next. But then we all looked at each other, and it hit us. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a random car parked. It wasn't just an ordinary person out for a drive. And with that, we all stood up almost at the same time. My heart was pounding in my chest as we started to walk away quickly, as casually as we could manage, but I kept glancing back. The car still hadn't moved, but we started picking up the pace, turning onto different streets, trying to put distance between us and it. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, still following us in some way. We went down alleyways, ducked through narrow passages, and headed toward the park, trying to get away. I kept looking over my shoulder to see if that car was still there, but we didn't see anything. For a while, we thought we were in the clear. Maybe we were just being paranoid. Maybe it had turned off somewhere else. But then we reached the park. I don't know why, but the air felt different as soon as we walked through the gate. The park at that time of day always seemed to have this kind of eerie, deserted feel to it, like it wasn't quite empty. But there wasn't anyone you could actually see. The swings creaked in the distance, but they were just moving by themselves. I didn't feel right walking under the tall trees that were casting long shadows, so I suggested we hide in the shadows under the table near the old basketball courts. It was dark, and we figured we could rest a bit and stay out of sight. We sat down in the cold shadows, trying to relax and act casual, like we weren't freaking out, even though my hands were shaking. We hadn't been there long before I glanced up, and that's when I saw it. The car was in the parking lot. It wasn't moving. It was just sitting there, parked, and the headlights were off now. It was still too quiet, and we hadn't seen anyone get out of it. But then the door opened. I don't know why, but everything in me froze. My friends must have noticed, too, because I saw them tense up, and we all stared as a man got out of the car. He was tall, wearing a hoodie, and I couldn't see his face clearly in the dim light. He started walking toward the park, his footsteps heavy, slow, but deliberate. We all sat there, still as statues, hoping he wouldn't see us. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't stay there. We had no idea if this guy was just some random person, or if something worse was happening. I could feel the fear creeping up, the panic starting to bubble up in my throat. We needed to go. There was no time to think. We all stood up at the same time and started moving toward the woods. We didn't say anything, just ran. We dashed into the trees, not looking back, just trying to get as far away as possible. My breath was coming in fast, panicked gasps, and I could hear my friends behind me, all of us crashing through the underbrush. We didn't care if we were making noise anymore. We had to get away. We spread out in the woods, hoping the guy wouldn't be able to find us. I don't even know why we thought that would work, but at the time, it felt like our only chance. We hid in the thick trees, barely breathing, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. The man's footsteps were still faintly audible, crunching on the dry leaves, but it was hard to tell where he was exactly. He walked through the woods for what felt like an eternity, checking between the trees, stopping every now and then. It felt like time stood still, and I was sure my heart was going to explode from the tension. Eventually, after what felt like forever, he turned around and walked back toward the parking lot. I don't know if he gave up or if he just decided we weren't worth the effort, but we didn't stick around to find out. We stayed hidden for a while longer, just waiting to be sure he was gone. When we finally felt it was safe, we crept back out of the woods, careful not to make any noise. We regrouped by the edge of the trees, standing in a huddle, still too scared to speak. We all knew something weird had just happened, but none of us had any idea what. It wasn't just some guy passing through. He had been following us, watching us, waiting for something. He hadn't said a word the entire time, just silently following us from one place to another. I don't think we fully understood it, even then, but we didn't feel safe anymore. We decided to leave the park as quickly as we could and head for the other side of the woods. It was a long walk, and none of us spoke much. We didn't have much to say. We were all in our heads, trying to make sense of it, but none of us could. The whole thing was strange, unsettling, and by the time we reached the other side of the woods, I was just relieved to be away from that creepy situation. To this day, I have no idea who that man was, or why he was following us. It's something that still bothers me sometimes, the fact that we were being watched without any explanation. I've thought about it a lot over the years, wondering if we had just narrowly escaped something, or if we had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the one thing I do know for sure is that whatever it was, I'm glad it ended the way it did. We walked back to our respective homes, each of us going our separate ways, still in shock, but no one said much about it. The whole thing stayed between us, buried somewhere deep in the back of our minds. But I'll never forget that feeling of being followed, of being watched. And every time I think about it, I still get that same feeling, like something was out there waiting. I remember the first time they sent me to the old hospital building. It wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary, just a check for break-ins, make sure no one was sneaking around, looking for supplies, or doing who knows what. It was just one of those routine shifts, and I was a casual worker at the time, so I didn't think much of it. It was just another night shift, the kind you get used to after a while. But this place was different. The new building was fine, modern, efficient. The old building, though, that was something else. It had been abandoned for years, since the early 2000s. They had built the new building next door, and just left the old one behind. I didn't think much of it at first either, but once I had to walk through it to get to that creepy old section, I began to feel the weight of its age. The air was thick with dust, and the old hospital smell lingered in every corner, like mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of smell that makes you feel uncomfortable, even if you can't explain why. The whole building was a maze of hallways, stairwells, and locked rooms. When they abandoned it, they didn't clean it out completely. Most of it was empty, but there were some storage areas here and there, filled with old medical equipment and supplies that probably hadn't seen daylight in decades. And no one went there, not unless they absolutely had to. During my shifts, I'd often be the one sent to check that the place hadn't been broken into. It wasn't a high-priority job, but it was my job nonetheless. To get to the abandoned part, I had to take a long detour through the basement of the new building, which was kind of a tunnel of its own. It was dark, cramped, and smelled of something old, like pipes that hadn't been fixed in a while. You'd follow the narrow hallway that eventually led you to the old mental health wing, the psych ward, where the walls still looked like they had never been updated since the 1950s. The paint was chipped, and the windows were either boarded up or broken. After passing through that area, I had to climb a narrow, steep set of stairs that creaked under my weight. It felt like stepping back in time. The kind of place you see in horror movies, except this wasn't a movie. This was real. Once you were at the top of the stairs, it was like walking into a different world. The abandoned wing was quiet, too quiet. You could hear the hum of the old heating units in the distance, but everything else was still. Everything seemed forgotten. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The walls were covered in graffiti, and broken windows let in the cold night air. It wasn't much different than other old places I'd seen in my life, dusty, rundown, with a couple of strange things left behind in random places. I remember kicking a piece of old wood down the hallway the first night I went in there. It was just lying in the middle of the floor, and I couldn't avoid it, so I gave it a quick kick to send it down the hall. It clattered off the floor and made a sound that echoed in the emptiness. I figured it was probably being used as some kind of makeshift door jam, considering how everything in that building seemed thrown together. The second night, I was sent there again. As I walked down the same hallway, I noticed the piece of wood had somehow moved. It wasn't in the same place where I'd kicked it the night before. It was now pushed against the wall, resting in a way that seemed intentional. It was small, and it didn't seem like much, but it caught my attention because, well, I hadn't seen anyone else around. No one else had been there before, and I was pretty sure I was the only one who had walked through that hallway in days. It didn't make sense. I knew I hadn't moved it, and there was no reason for anyone else to be there. The thought crossed my mind that maybe someone had snuck in overnight, but I didn't think much of it. It was an old building. Who cared about a piece of wood? About a month passed after that second night. I didn't give it much thought, just another routine check. Then one day, I was talking to my supervisor, and she casually mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said, "You know, the locals say that part of the building is haunted." I laughed it off. What else could I do? People in small towns always had strange stories. But then she told me something that stopped me in my tracks. She said, "That piece of wood you kicked? The locals claim it moves every time they're in there. No one goes in that building at night except for us, but every time, they say it's been moved, and they can't explain how. It's like someone's putting it back in place every time, without fail." At first, I thought she was just messing with me, but as she kept talking, I felt this uneasy feeling grow in my stomach. I could remember that piece of wood, perfectly placed against the wall, where it had no business being. No one else had gone in there, not that I knew of. I was sure of that. After that conversation, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. The wind, maybe, or someone else who had been in there while I wasn't looking. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was another night after that, one of those shifts where you feel like everything is just a little too quiet. I went back in, determined to check again and make sure everything was locked up. I'd gotten used to the dark, musty air and the eerie silence by then. As I walked down the same hallway, I froze. That piece of wood. It was there again, but this time, it was on the floor in the middle of the hallway, just sitting there like it was waiting for me. And it didn't make any sense. I hadn't seen it there before. It wasn't there when I passed by earlier. I bent down, grabbed the wood, and stared at it for a moment. The edges were worn, like it had been there longer than I thought. It felt old, heavier than it should have been. Maybe I was just imagining things, but I didn't like the way it felt. I put it back where I had seen it last and left the building, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. From then on, I avoided the old building altogether, and every time dispatch had anything for that hospital, I made sure to check the exteriors, look for any signs of break-ins or people lingering. The last thing I wanted was to be anywhere near that place after dark. I never went back into that abandoned part of the hospital again, and I made sure to make it clear to my supervisor that I wasn't interested in going back in there, either. It wasn't just the piece of wood. It was everything. The weird sounds, the shadows, the feeling that I wasn't alone when I was certain no one else was there. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to take any chances. Every now and then, I still think about that building, about the piece of wood, about the feeling that I was being watched. But I don't have an answer for what happened in there, and I don't think I ever will. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. If the locals were right, and that piece of wood was always being moved by someone, or something, then it wasn't just the building that was haunted. It was me too, and I wasn't about to find out what that meant. I've never returned to that hospital since, and I don't plan to. Some places, some things, are better left alone. The abandoned building, the forgotten corners of the world, they all hold secrets. And sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and never look back. It was supposed to be a simple hunt, just like any other. My dad, a seasoned outdoorsman with over 40 years of experience, had always felt at home in the wilderness. He'd spent his entire adult life roaming through forests, climbing mountains, and navigating rivers. There was nothing out there that could really shake him. But this thing that happened one evening, when he went hog hunting with his two friends, a married couple, left him with a feeling he couldn't shake. Even now, decades later, when I ask him about it, he gets quiet, almost as though he doesn't want to go back to that place. They were hunting in a wooded area that stretched for miles. Thick trees, dense underbrush, and the kind of silence you only get deep in the woods. The air was heavy, the kind of humidity you feel in your bones when you're deep in Florida. It was getting late, and they had already spent a good part of the day tracking signs of hogs. My dad, along with his friend, the husband of the couple, were walking a well-worn path, trying to find the wife who had gone ahead of them earlier. She was a strong, independent woman, used to being out in the wild as much as they were, but even seasoned hunters don't go out alone when it's getting dark. The three of them had split up around 4 p.m. They had planned to reconvene by dusk. My dad and his friend were heading toward the area where they thought she might be when something strange happened. The woods, which had been alive with the usual sounds, birds calling, the rustling of small critters in the undergrowth, the hum of insects, fell silent. And when I say silent, I mean complete silence. No wind, no animal noises. It was so quiet that it felt unnatural. My dad said he could almost feel the air pressure change, like the woods were holding their breath. The kind of silence that only happens when something big is nearby. He paused, motioning for his friend to stop too. They both looked around, instinctively scanning their surroundings, trying to figure out what had caused the sudden stillness. My dad said his gut twisted. It was like an instinctual alert, a warning. When you've been out in the wild as long as he had, you get a sense for these things. Something wasn't right. "Listen," his friend whispered. His voice was tight, a little on edge. My dad barely nodded, his eyes darting through the shadows between the trees. They had seen all sorts of wildlife over the years. Deer, wild boar, bears. But there was something different about this feeling. Something larger, something they couldn't see. They stood still for what felt like an eternity, just waiting. The silence stretched on, too long, too unnatural. Then, without warning, the silence was shattered by the loudest scream either of them had ever heard. It was primal, violent in its intensity. And it wasn't quite human, but it wasn't quite animal either. A horrible, screeching sound that rattled my dad to his bones. He couldn't tell if it was coming from the trees ahead or from behind. It sounded so close, like it was right next to them. He couldn't make out any details of it, no shape or form, but he knew, it wasn't something normal. It wasn't any kind of animal he'd ever heard before. His heart was pounding now, a stark contrast to the calm he'd always felt in the woods. His friend looked at him, and they both exchanged that unspoken, oh shit glance. The kind that only happens when you're in a situation you know you need to get out of, and fast. No hesitation, no second guessing. They turned and started running back towards the trucks. My dad said he couldn't remember the last time he'd moved so fast through the woods. He didn't look back, but the sound of that scream haunted him. He could still hear it echoing in his mind, even as they made their way down the narrow trail. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. What the hell had that been? They reached the trucks in record time, hearts still racing, muscles tense from the sudden sprint. The wife was already there. She was standing by their truck, wide-eyed, her face ashen, and tears streaming down her cheeks. She was shaking, clearly rattled. "I heard it too," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "What was that? What was that sound?" She didn't need to ask. My dad knew what she was talking about. He hadn't even told her about the scream yet, but she had heard it too. She had been walking in a different direction, closer to where they had heard it. But even from the distance she was at, the sound had carried through the woods. "I don't know," my dad said, his voice low. There were no words for what had happened. "But we're getting the hell out of here." They didn't waste any more time. My dad slammed the truck door shut, and they all jumped into their vehicles. My dad could barely breathe, not from exhaustion, but from the shock of what they'd just experienced. As they peeled out, he glanced into the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind them. The woods seemed to swallow up the sound of their engines as they drove away. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching them, waiting. It wasn't until much later, when they were back in town and sitting in a small diner, that they started talking about it. His friend, the husband, had spent years out in the woods too. He had seen his fair share of things, bears, alligators, wild hogs, but even he was unnerved. They all were. They didn't have an explanation, and none of them were eager to return to that spot. "You think it was a big cat?" the husband asked. But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. Big cats don't make sounds like that. My dad shook his head. No, he said. It wasn't a cat. Not a bear either. They discussed it for hours, but none of them could come up with an answer. No one had heard anything like that before. Not a scream, not a roar, not a growl. It was too guttural, too twisted. It didn't fit into any category of animal they knew. I don't know what it was, my dad said, his voice rough. But it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered. And that's where it ended. That was the last time my dad ever spoke about it in detail. Oh, he'd tell a story about it here and there, casual, almost like a passing comment. But every time I asked him more about it, he would get quiet. He never answered directly. He would just shrug, like the answer didn't matter. He'd always say, it wasn't a big cat, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a bird, and it wasn't human. The closest I ever got to hearing him offer an explanation came when I jokingly asked him if he thought it was a skunk ape, the Florida equivalent of Bigfoot. My dad just shrugged again. He didn't laugh. He didn't get mad. He just looked at me with those deep eyes that had seen so much, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty there. But that was all. To this day, I can't help but wonder what they heard that night. There's no clear answer. No tidy explanation. My dad still won't go back to that place. And neither will his friends. Whatever they encountered out there that evening left a mark on them. Something that none of their years of experience in the wilderness could explain away. And maybe that's what really shook them. That in all their years of tracking, of hunting, of living in the woods, there was something they had come across that defied explanation. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Or maybe something that had always been there, hiding in the shadows of the wild, waiting for the moment when it would make itself known. The night shift at the university's dairy farm was one I'd gotten used to, but there was something about that particular night that left me with an unsettled feeling that stuck with me long after the shift was over. I had been working there for 4 years, mostly on Friday nights. The hours were long, and the work was hard, but it was quiet, and the silence gave me space to think, a rare luxury in the hustle of college life. It was a typical Friday night. The cows were being milked, and I was assigned my usual job, pushing the cattle to the parlor for milking and cleaning their stalls afterward. There was always a small team on the night shift, just the milker, the pusher, me, and someone to watch over the calves and cows who were about to give birth. On rare occasions, there might be another person handling some other task on the farm, but it wasn't busy. It was just me and the milker, mostly, with a few calves to keep an eye on. The barns were set far back from the main campus, isolated out in the country. The area was surrounded by dense fields and a few patches of woods. I was used to the solitude. The barn had large, open doors, and the faint glow of the overhead lights bathed the area in a soft yellow hue. The sound of hooves clinking against the cement floor, the low mooing of cows, and the rhythm of the milking machine working its way along the cattle were like background noise. That night, however, I started noticing something unusual, something that would soon unravel into an experience that I couldn't shake. I was walking to get another pen to bring the cows up to the parlor when I glanced outside. It was dark, but not completely pitch black. The light from the barn cast long shadows. I thought I saw something move, a figure moving between the shadows near the barn's edge. I stopped and did a double take, blinking, trying to adjust my eyes to the low light. At first, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I'd been working a long time without much sleep during the week, and the darkness could do that, make your brain see things that weren't really there. I shrugged it off and carried on with my work. As I began to lead the cattle towards the milking parlor, I saw it again. This time, there was no denying it, a person. It wasn't a cow or a shadow from the barn, but a person. They were walking slowly, just outside the barn, moving between the rows of old, rusted machinery. The person didn't seem to be in a hurry, and I couldn't make out much about them. Their figure was just a dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. The more I stared, the more uneasy I became. Who the hell would be out there at this hour? It was almost 1 a.m., and no one worked out there late on a Friday night. I didn't know what to make of it, but I was able to calm myself with excuses. Maybe it was just a fellow employee, though I hadn't seen anyone else working that night. Maybe it was some random person who had wandered out there, lost, or someone just trying to have a late-night walk. I didn't really know, but I tried to push it from my mind as I led the cows into the milking parlor. Still, the unease remained, a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. I finished up with the cows, cleaned out their stalls, and was about to go back for another load of cows when I saw the figure again. This time, though, there was something different. The person wasn't moving. They were standing there, still watching me. I froze for a moment. It was hard to make out much detail in the dim light, but there was no mistaking it. They were staring right at me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the feeling of something wrong. I didn't know what to do. I had a few thoughts flash through my mind, none of them particularly helpful. I thought about going back inside the barn or getting the milker's attention, but instead, I chose to do nothing. I tried to act like it didn't matter, like it was just some random person, though deep down I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. I just hoped that whatever it was would leave. The next hour or so felt like it dragged on forever. I couldn't focus on my work, my thoughts drifting back to that figure standing out there. By the time I finished cleaning the last pen, it was almost 2 a.m. I was walking back to get the cows from the parlor when I saw the figure again, this time closer. They were standing near the pens, their back to me. I could make out a shape, though it was hard to tell much more. For a second, I thought about just ignoring it, but my heart was racing. There was something about the way they stood, too still, too deliberate, that made me uneasy. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. My instincts were telling me that something was wrong. I turned around and walked quickly back to the parlor, panic rising in my chest. I found the milker, my voice shaking as I told him what I'd seen. We both stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The milker, being the braver one, suggested we check it out together. If it was just some curious person, maybe they'd just leave. We grabbed a couple of metal pipes from the storage shed, partly for protection and partly to try and scare whoever it was off. We walked to the spot where I had seen the person standing, trying to stay quiet. The barn was still, and the only sounds were the low murmurs of cows in the background. As we approached the pen where I'd seen the figure, we saw it again. The person was moving slowly towards us, their figure shifting in and out of the shadows. My heart was hammering in my chest. The milker called out, his voice steady but loud. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" As soon as the person heard the shout, they froze for a second, and then, without a word, they turned and took off running. It was quick, too quick, almost like they were already anticipating us. They disappeared into the night, running toward the trees that bordered the field, blending with the darkness. For a moment, we just stood there, staring into the empty darkness. I could feel the adrenaline still coursing through my veins, but also a strange mix of relief. Whoever it was, they were gone. The milker turned to me, his face pale. He asked if I'd seen what he thought he'd seen, and I nodded. I hadn't imagined it. There had been someone out there, and they had been watching us. We didn't see the person again that night, or any other night after that. The rest of the shift passed in tense silence, the air still thick with unease. We didn't talk much, just finished our work and got out of there as quickly as we could. When it was over, I went home, trying to push the night out of my mind. But it didn't go away. For the next few weeks, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, every time I walked into the barn, every time I walked back to get the cows. I kept expecting to see that person again, but I never did. Stupidly, we never informed the manager or the police. I don't know why we didn't. Maybe it was because we couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe it was because we hoped it was just some odd, random encounter, something that would never happen again. But the reality is I was scared. We all were. And I didn't want to think about it more than I had to. It was hard not to wonder why someone would be out there in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. watching the farm. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but that night made me question everything I thought I knew about the farm. I worked the night shift for a while longer, but after that, it was never the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was always out there watching. It was a warm, late afternoon, the kind of time when the sun was still high enough to cast long, angled shadows through the trees. I had been living at my dad's house for a few years, in a small rural area that bordered a stretch of woods. My dad was a big fan of animals, so the house was always filled with cats, strays he had rescued and ones that had wandered in from the woods. We were far enough out in the country that our neighbors were few and spread out. The house felt secluded, with trees on all sides and a long driveway that was barely visible from the road. That day, I decided to take a walk into the woods behind the house. I had grown up there, and knew those woods like the back of my hand. It was a peaceful spot, filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, and I loved the solitude. It was a usual thing for me to go wandering back there, especially when I needed some time to myself. The air was cool, and the trees were dense enough to block out most of the sun. I was walking along a small trail that cut through the woods behind the house when I heard something. At first, it was just a slight rustling of leaves, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't unusual. It could have been a deer or one of the cats. We had a lot of them back then, and they liked to roam the area. I wasn't worried at first, just thinking it was one of them. "Here, kitty," I called out, thinking one of the cats had wandered off too far. I tried to make my voice light, like I always did when calling the cats, but there was no answer. The rustling grew louder, closer, and more deliberate. Something big was moving through the brush, something that wasn't a cat. It sounded too heavy, too purposeful. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat as my heart skipped a beat. That sound wasn't right. I took a few cautious steps back, my instincts kicking in. The rustling stopped for a moment. I strained my ears, trying to make out what was happening. Then I heard it again, louder this time. Whatever it was coming toward me. It wasn't just walking, it was charging through the woods. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. My mind raced. My first thought was that it was one of the big cats, maybe one of the mountain lions that occasionally wandered the area. But something told me this wasn't a cat. The way it moved, the sound of its steps, it was something much bigger. My heart was pounding now, my senses on high alert. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted back toward the house, my mind screaming at me to get out of there as fast as I could. I didn't dare look back to see what was behind me. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder. I finally broke through the tree-line and into the open space near the house. I didn't stop until I was safely inside. I locked the door behind me, my mind still racing. What had I just heard? What had been in those woods? I didn't go back out the next day. I didn't even look to see if there were any prints. I was too shaken, too unsettled, and something in me knew that if I went back to check, I'd find something I wasn't ready to see. The second incident happened a few years later when I was in high school. I lived just down the road from the middle school, a short walk away, but I was tired of riding the bus every day. The bus was always packed, noisy, and uncomfortable, so I decided to start walking to school instead. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 20 minutes, but it was a lot better than sitting on that bus for an hour each way. The road I walked along was quiet, lined with trees and some small houses scattered far apart. One morning, as I was walking, a red four-door car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a man inside asked, "Do you need a ride?" I was surprised but politely told him, "No, I'm almost there." I could tell the man wasn't in a rush, so I figured he was just being kind, offering a ride to someone he thought might need one. I kept walking, but I noticed the car slowed down and pulled up again a little further ahead of me. The man asked if I was sure I didn't need a ride. His voice was a little too insistent for my liking. I glanced at the back of the car and saw that there was a lot of stuff in it, old bags, boxes, and some other random items. Something about the situation made me uneasy, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I just told him, "No thanks," again and turned into the school driveway. The dean of the school was always outside in the mornings, waiting for the kids to arrive. He was a friendly guy, and I had known him for years. When I saw him, I waved and said, "Good morning." He asked how my walk was, the usual routine. But this time, I told him about the man in the car, about how he had stopped twice and kept asking if I needed a ride. The dean's expression changed. It was subtle, but I noticed it. His face tightened, and he asked me a few more questions about the man. I thought it was odd, but I figured he was just looking out for me. He told me to head on to class, and I didn't think much of it. But then, during first period, I got called to the office. I walked down the hall, still unsure what was going on. When I got there, the school's resource officer was sitting in the office, looking serious. He started asking me questions about the man in the red car. I was confused. What was going on? Why were they making such a big deal about it? I thought the officer was just being protective, but I didn't realize how serious the situation was until later. They asked me to describe the man, the car, everything I could remember. I gave them all the details I could, not thinking much of it at the time. They didn't tell me much more after that. I just went back to class, and the day went on as usual. But looking back, I realized they had been concerned. That man had been trying to get me into his car twice, and I had been too naive to understand the danger I was in. It wasn't until last year, when I thought back to that morning, that I understood how close I had come to a dangerous situation. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized how fortunate I had been. The man could have been anyone, and his persistence was something I should have recognized sooner as a red flag. I'm lucky I didn't get into that car. The whole thing made me realize just how many warning signs I had missed. I never saw that man again. I don't know what would have happened if I had gotten into his car, or if I had just been a little more gullible. But the way the dean and the resource officer reacted made it clear to me now that they knew something I didn't. They were scared, and they had every right to be. Now, when I look back at those moments, I feel a deep sense of relief. I'm grateful that I had the instinct to say no, even though I didn't fully understand why at the time. And I'm thankful for the people who noticed, who took action to make sure I was safe. I don't take my safety for granted anymore. Those two incidents, the one in the woods and the one with the man in the car, have stayed with me, reminders of how quickly things can go wrong and how important it is to trust your instincts. It was late one night during my sophomore year of high school, and I was biking home from my friend's place. I'd stayed later than I should have. We'd been watching movies in her basement and lost track of time. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was how thick the fog had gotten. It wasn't just misty, it was like a wall of white hanging in the air, swallowing everything more than a few feet away. I could barely see the outline of my bike, and the porch light above me barely reached the steps. My friend lived a few miles away from my house. We were both from the countryside, the kind of place where neighbors were a few fields apart and the roads curved through open farmland and patches of woods. No sidewalks, no street lamps, no traffic. Just long stretches of quiet, narrow road with ditches on either side and the occasional wooden fence running along the fields. I wasn't scared at first. I was used to being out in the dark. Living where I did, I'd had my fair share of moonlit walks or riding home late. I had a good bike light, one of those bright white LEDs that lit up the road ahead of me in a clear beam. It gave me a decent view of the pavement, maybe 10 or 12 feet ahead, and just a little peripheral view to the sides. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. The fog made everything look different. The trees were faint shadows in the distance, like ghosts, and the fields on either side of the road were completely gone from view. Even the sound was different, muted and close, like the fog was pressing in on everything, swallowing up the wind and the crickets and the distant barking of dogs. All I could hear was the soft hum of my tires on the pavement and the occasional creak of the bike chain when I pedaled. I remember feeling a little on edge, but I told myself it was just the fog making things creepy. I'd biked this road dozens of times. I knew every curve, every dip and hill. The part one was coming up on was a familiar downhill slope that led to a small wooden bridge over a creek. The road dipped sharply for a bit, and then curved back up the other side. In the daytime, it was a nice coast. You didn't have to pedal for a solid 30 seconds. But at night, especially on a foggy night like this one, it felt like riding into a tunnel. I started coasting down the slope, letting off the pedals, and letting the bike carry me forward. The light on my bike flickered slightly as the angle changed, but it was still working. I kept my hands loosely on the handlebars, fingers resting lightly on the brakes, just in case. Then something moved. I didn't hear it first. I saw it. 1 second the road ahead of me was empty, lit only by the dull glow of my bike light. The next second, there was something in it. A shape, big and low to the ground, right in the middle of the road, just past the start of the bridge. I yanked the brakes immediately, instinctively, but nothing happened. My hands squeezed down hard, but I didn't slow at all. The wheels kept turning. I felt my stomach drop. My bike wasn't stopping. The brakes must have gotten wet from the fog, or maybe they were just worn out. I honestly don't remember ever checking them closely before that night. But now, barreling down that hill toward a dark shape in the road, they didn't work at all. I had no choice but to drag my feet. I slammed my shoes to the pavement on either side of the bike, grinding them hard to slow myself down. The sound was awful, rubber scraping rough asphalt, and I could feel the vibration shoot up through my legs and into my hips. I skidded, barely keeping the bike upright, and finally came to a shaky stop just a few feet from the shape. I was breathing hard, heart pounding, my legs shaking from the effort and the adrenaline. The fog swirled around the beam of my bike light, distorting everything. But the shape was still there. It looked like a dog. A big one. Maybe a Pyrenean or something similar. Long, thick hair, low tail, sturdy legs. I couldn't see the details clearly because the fog was so dense, but the shape was clear enough. It wasn't crouching or growling or doing anything aggressive. It was just standing there, facing me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe for a second. My hands were clenched tight on the handlebars, even though I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't want to startle it. I didn't know what kind of animal it was. Could have been a stray or a coyote or a farm dog from one of the nearby properties. It didn't look starved or mangy, at least not from what I could see. But it was so still. Not curious, not afraid. Just watching. The weird thing was, even though my light was pointed straight at it, maybe 10 or 12 feet away, I couldn't see its eyes. Usually, animals reflect light. Even cats or raccoons you see on the side of the road will have that bright eye shine. But this one didn't. Its face was just shadow. No glint. No flash. Nothing. It stood there for what felt like forever. I couldn't hear it panting or shifting its weight or making any noise at all. I could only hear my own heartbeat and my breathing and the faint rustle of the fog brushing past me. Then slowly it turned. Not quickly or with any panic. Just calm and steady, like it didn't care that I was there. It walked off to the side of the road, into the fog. And then it was gone. Now, here's the part that made my stomach twist. We were on the bridge when it turned. I was near the center of it, and the animal had been standing just ahead of me, on the slight incline where the bridge started to rise again on the other side. So when it turned and walked off to the side, it would have had to go over the edge. But I didn't hear anything. No splash. No thud. No rustling leaves or brush. Just nothing. It was like it vanished. I sat there, frozen, for a few more seconds. I scanned the area with my light, but the fog was too thick. I couldn't even see the side of the bridge. My mind was trying to explain it. Maybe it had walked onto a narrow path beside the bridge. Maybe it had jumped down into the ditch quietly. Maybe the fog was just muffling all the sounds. Maybe. But I couldn't stay there any longer. I kicked the pedal, turned the handlebars slightly to get my balance, and pushed off. I rode hard, harder than I ever had before, legs pumping like mad. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down until I was halfway up the next hill. Even then, I kept checking behind me, heart still pounding. The rest of the ride home was a blur. The fog didn't lift. If anything, it got worse. I couldn't see the landmarks I usually used to judge how close I was getting to home. Trees looked like monsters. Mailboxes looked like crouching figures. Every sound made me jump, the creak of the chain, the occasional snap of a twig in the brush. When I finally saw the faint outline of our front gate, I nearly cried. I rolled up to the driveway, dropped my bike on the gravel without even putting it on the stand, and ran inside. The house was warm and full of light, and the sudden contrast made the whole ride feel like a dream. My parents were in the living room watching TV, and they looked up like nothing was wrong. I didn't tell them everything right away. Just said I saw a big dog in the road, and that my brakes weren't working right. My dad nodded and said it was probably a farm dog. There were plenty around. My mom said I shouldn't have been biking that late anyway, especially in fog like that. I went to my room, peeled off my shoes, they were scuffed up bad from the skidding, and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. The image of that shape in the road wouldn't leave my mind. The way it didn't move when I skidded to a stop. The way it turned and vanished without a sound. And the fact that I never saw its eyes. The next day, I checked the bridge in the daylight. I biked back out there, after fixing my brakes, and stopped near the spot where I'd seen the animal. In the daylight, it looked so normal. Just a wooden bridge over a dry creek bed with weeds and a few bushes. The side where the dog had walked off didn't have any kind of trail. It dropped off into a shallow ditch with rocks and old leaves. Nothing that looked like it would hide a large animal. I didn't see any paw prints, but that wasn't surprising. It had been too dry for mud, and the gravel didn't hold impressions well. I thought about going and asking around, seeing if any nearby farms had lost a dog recently, but I didn't. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. For days afterward, I kept playing it over in my mind. I tried to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe my light had been at the wrong angle. Maybe the fog had messed with my perception. Maybe it had been a normal dog, and I was just shaken because I was alone and scared, and it had all happened so fast. But that didn't explain the missing eye shine, or the silence. or how it walked off the side of the bridge without making a sound, and the way it stood so still, like it had been waiting. It's been years since that night, and I still remember it clearly. I never saw anything like it again. I still bike sometimes, though mostly during the day now. I keep my brakes in good shape, and I always double-check my light before leaving. I've told a few people about it over the years, but no one ever thought it was a big deal. Just a weird foggy night with a farm dog in the road. But that wasn't how it felt. That night, in the middle of that bridge with the fog curling around me and the light shaking in my hands, it felt like something else. Not supernatural, not a ghost or a monster, just something off. Something I couldn't explain. Something that shouldn't have been there. And sometimes I still think about it when I'm riding alone. When the air is still and the sky is dark, and I hear something rustling just out of sight. I never found out what it really was. I probably never will. But I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. And that's enough to keep me riding home before dark. Every time. It was around 10:45 at night when it happened. I remember the time exactly because I had just looked at the big wall clock above the maintenance hallway while walking back to my station. I'd been working the night shift at the paper factory for a little over a year by then, and I was used to the noise, the rhythm, the lights, the feel of the whole place. It was like a beast of its own. Everything moved, hummed, clanked, groaned, rolled, and hissed in a kind of organized chaos. That night was nothing special. Same smell of oil and paper pulp. Same sticky floors in places. Same muffled music coming from someone's small Bluetooth speaker over by the loading dock. Same machines roaring and chugging along like they always did, until it all just stopped. At first, it didn't even feel real. It was like my brain took a second to catch up. I was standing near the conveyor that fed long sheets of pulp into the press rollers, and the rollers were just doing their thing, pressing, spinning, spraying little flecks of water into the air that caught in the lights overhead like dust. Then, it was like someone flipped a switch on the world. Everything died. The machines didn't ease down like they were supposed to during a planned stop. They didn't gradually slow or beep with warning. They slammed to a stop. There was a high-pitched metallic screech, like gears grinding too hard against each other, and then silence, thick, complete silence. That was the first time I'd ever heard silence in the factory. It was horrifying. And then came the dark. Pitch black. The overhead lights were just gone. Emergency lights didn't flicker on. The backup generator that's supposed to kick in during outages didn't do a damn thing. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I'd gone blind. I waved my hand in front of my face and saw nothing, not even a blur or shadow. It was the kind of dark that makes your skin crawl, the kind that pulls at your chest and makes your breath feel heavier. I didn't move. Nobody moved. That's the thing. You could almost feel it, this collective holding of breath, every person frozen in place. Everyone knew how dangerous the factory was, even under normal conditions. You take one wrong step, and you could fall into something that doesn't forgive. And in the dark, you'd be lucky not to break your neck walking into a metal frame or tripping over a loose pallet. We all knew that, so nobody moved an inch. There was no warning, no flickering, no buzz, just on one second off the next. I stood there with my hand still resting on the cold edge of the conveyor, heart thudding in my chest. The air suddenly felt different, thicker, like the dark itself was pressing down on us. And the silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. You could almost hear everyone else's heartbeats, the small sounds of breathing, the little creaks of people shifting just slightly in place. It was only 2 minutes, but I swear to God it felt like an hour. I started to count seconds in my head, just to stay calm, just to have something to do while standing in that crushing black silence. My ears felt like they were straining for sound. I was trying to listen for any hint of light returning, a click, a buzz, a distant voice, anything. But it was just empty. Even the air itself felt wrong without the constant rumble and hiss of the machines. The place was never quiet, not even during break times. There was always something in the background, like the whole place had lungs. My thoughts started racing. I remember wondering if something worse was happening. Maybe there had been an explosion nearby. Maybe we were under some kind of attack. Maybe there was a gas leak and we were all about to pass out. When the lights go out like that and nothing works, your brain goes straight to the worst possibilities. But mostly, I was scared of the dark. Not the childish kind of fear, not monsters or ghosts or any of that. It was fear of what I couldn't see. The machines around me, the walkways, the corners, they were all hazards now. One misstep, one move without knowing where you're going, and you could seriously hurt yourself or someone else. And I didn't even know who might be nearby. We were all scattered around our stations. Someone might have been 5 feet from me, and I wouldn't have known until it was too late. Then, finally, the floodlights started to buzz. Not all at once. One by one. The first one flickered weakly in the far corner near the loading dock, casting a sickly yellow beam that looked like it was underwater. Then another blinked on near the safety station, then another above the big press rollers. Each light took its time warming up, buzzing and humming like they were waking from a coma. The shadows slowly started to pull back, but they didn't go easily. The factory didn't feel right, not even with the lights on. We were all still standing still when the foreman's flashlight finally cut through the air from across the factory floor. It wasn't until that moment that people started to speak, or shift, or breathe again. That first sound of someone's boots shuffling on the concrete floor made my skin crawl, like the silence had been a spell, and someone had just broken it. Eventually, we learned what had happened. A drunk driver had slammed into a lamppost about half a block from the factory. The pole collapsed and brought down a big chunk of the electrical lines with it. Power across the whole block had gone out instantly, and because of how old our grid was, the backups didn't kick in like they were supposed to. They'd have to check the generator and do a full inspection, but that wouldn't be for a while. The bigger problem, at least immediately, was the machines. Some of those machines had paper running through them at the moment they stopped. And when machines like those stop suddenly, like really, completely stop instead of slowly shutting down, the damage can be bad. Gears seize, rollers lock, bearings get stripped, motors overheat or short out. We weren't even allowed to touch anything until the safety crew gave the all clear and maintenance had a chance to inspect each piece of equipment. One of the older guys, who had worked there for almost 20 years, said he'd never seen anything like it. Not just the blackout, but the way it hit. Instant. Total. And the fact that nothing even tried to come back online for those full 2 minutes. He said it felt like the building had died for a moment. And that's exactly what it felt like. Like a giant, living thing had suddenly stopped breathing. The hum, the shake of the floors, the heat of the machinery, even the familiar stink of wet pulp and oil. All of it had vanished in an instant. And for 2 solid minutes, it was like we were trapped in a black box, waiting to see if anything would come back. I didn't sleep right for a few nights after that. Not because of nightmares or anything like that. Just this weird aftershock of unease. Like my brain couldn't let go of the way everything had just stopped. Even when I was at home, I kept glancing at the lights, half expecting them to flicker out again. I started keeping a small flashlight in my work jacket. Nothing big, just one of those slim ones you can clip to your pocket. I didn't even think much about doing it. It just felt necessary. The factory took a few days to get fully running again. They had to replace a motor on one of the older machines. A bunch of paper was lost, caught in rollers that seized up or got misaligned when the power cut out. Maintenance said we were lucky. It could have been worse. If someone had been adjusting one of the machines or doing hands-on work when it happened, we could have had a serious injury on our hands. But we didn't. Everyone froze in place, like instinct kicked in. We knew not to move. And that probably saved someone. After everything was back up, people joked about it a little, the way people do to cope. But no one really laughed. There was this shared look in everyone's eyes, that quiet understanding that for a couple of minutes, things could have gone very wrong. Even the foreman, who usually brushed off stuff like that, admitted it was the most dangerous moment the factory had seen in years. For me, it stuck. That shift rewired something in my head. The way the dark filled every inch of space, the way the silence pressed in, the way I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face, it all stayed with me. I'd always thought of the factory as a loud, chaotic place. But now I knew how deadly that silence could be. I never forgot it. Even now, years later, whenever the lights flicker at work, even just for a second, my heart jumps. I remember standing there frozen, surrounded by steel and gears and rollers the size of trucks, unable to move, unable to see, counting seconds and praying for light. Just 2 minutes. That's all it was. But it felt like forever. The air was thick with the smell of salt water as I walked alongside my girlfriend down the worn path. our footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the abandoned military base. The complex sprawled out before us, massive and desolate, right on the edge of the ocean. It was a place I'd explored many times before, but this time, something felt different. We were standing in front of a vast, rusted structure, the remnants of a hangar where submarines once hid from the world's watchful eyes. The ocean breeze stirred the old concrete slabs that lined the base, but there was a stillness in the air that I couldn't quite shake. I had been to this base more times than I could count, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone, always during the day, but occasionally at night too. The hangar, the barracks, the pump rooms, all abandoned and left to rot in the salty air. There were acres of overgrown fields, cracked and crumbling buildings, all silent witnesses to a time long past. Yet, despite its eerie history, I'd never had any particular reason to feel scared. Not until today. We were standing outside the hangar, chatting quietly, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at my girlfriend, but she hadn't seemed to notice. She was looking out at the ocean, lost in her thoughts, the wind tugging at her hair. The sound wasn't exactly thunderous, but it was sharp, like the crash of a bottle or a window being broken. It echoed through the empty base, hanging in the air for just a moment too long. I didn't mention it to her immediately. I didn't want to spook her, but I felt a creeping unease run down my spine. Maybe it was nothing, a piece of debris falling, maybe an animal knocking something over. That seemed the most likely explanation. I forced myself to focus on the view, but my mind kept drifting back to the sound. After a while, I tried to push the unease aside, leading her toward the barracks. We stepped over broken tiles and climbed through twisted metal, wandering from room to room, the entire place completely silent save for the occasional gust of wind. The large open spaces felt oppressive now, as though they were suffocating under the weight of their own decay. The smell of rust and salt water was thick in the air, and the faint scent of mildew lingered everywhere. When we reached the hangar, I noticed something that sent a chill through me, faint whispers. The sound was so quiet that I wasn't sure if I was hearing it or imagining it. It was coming from the dark interior of the hangar, the same place where I'd seen so many things rusting away. I didn't say anything to my girlfriend, though. She wasn't keen on going into the hangar anyway, and I didn't want to make her more nervous. She had her own sense of the place, always hesitant to venture into the darker corners of the abandoned base. Her eyes lingered on the entrance, but she turned away without saying anything, and I followed. We moved on, checking out the old pump rooms and the remnants of crumbling buildings. Each corner felt more abandoned than the last, with weeds and vines overtaking parts of the structure, climbing up walls and cracking through windows. The deeper we went, the older the buildings seemed to get. These were the remnants from before the Cold War, the ones that had long been abandoned even by the military. As we walked toward the shore, I could feel the salt in the air getting stronger, the sound of waves crashing softly against the rocks below. These buildings, though, seemed even more forgotten. The concrete was crumbling, the metal rusted into a flaky, orange crust. There was no sign of human life in sight, and that made the place feel even more isolated. We reached a narrow corridor between two buildings, long and winding, the walls leaning inward like they might collapse at any moment. The silence was palpable, broken only by the occasional squawk of a seagull overhead. That's when it happened. A loud bang echoed through the corridor. It wasn't just a knock or a thud, but a crash that rattled the air around us. It sounded like a door slamming shut, or maybe something far heavier. The noise was so sudden and so loud that it stopped me dead in my tracks. My girlfriend spun around, her eyes wide with fear. Without a word, she bolted. She didn't hesitate, didn't even look back. She ran down the corridor, her footsteps pounding against the cracked concrete, her breath sharp in the still air. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to stay and investigate, to find the logical explanation for the sound. It could have been anything, right? Another animal? A piece of debris falling from a higher window? Maybe something had shifted inside one of the buildings. But the logical thoughts didn't come easily. My pulse was racing, my nerves were on edge, and that feeling of being watched from before had returned, heavier now. I hesitated for only a moment longer before I started running after her. She was already far ahead of me, her footsteps echoing down the path. She didn't stop until we reached the more open area near the shore, where the ocean's waves crashed louder in the background. I caught up to her, my breath ragged as I tried to steady myself. "What was that?" she gasped. her voice trembling slightly. I don't know, I said, though I didn't believe my own words. Could have been the wind, or an animal. I don't know, but that didn't feel right. The wind had been completely still all day, and there hadn't been any sign of an animal in the area, not one that would make a noise like that. It had been too loud, too distinct. We stood there for a while, not speaking, as the waves beat against the rocks. I felt the weight of the place around me, the remnants of the Cold War, and whatever secrets it held. I wanted to say something to ease her fear, but nothing seemed to make sense. We had heard something. Something loud. Something heavy. After a while, we decided to leave, retracing our steps back toward the entrance. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching us. The unease lingered like a shadow, following us even as we neared the exit of the base. We didn't speak much on the way back. It wasn't because we were angry or upset, it was just quiet. The air between us was thick with the weight of what had happened, and neither of us seemed to have the words to describe it. The rest of the walk felt longer than it should have, each step heavier, the buildings towering above us like silent, abandoned sentinels. When we reached the edge of the base, the sun had started to dip lower, casting long shadows across the crumbling structures. We left the complex behind us, stepping onto the old road that led back to the main highway. As we got into the car and drove away, I couldn't help but wonder. Had we been alone in that place? Or had someone, or something, been watching us the whole time? It was a question I couldn't answer, and the not knowing gnawed at me. I had spent so many hours in that base, exploring without a care, but this time, something was different. We'd been spooked. No doubt about it. Maybe it was the isolation of the place. Maybe it was the broken glass we'd heard, or the whispers in the hangar. Or maybe it was the bang, that deafening noise that seemed to come from nowhere. But one thing was certain. We weren't alone in that abandoned base. And maybe, just maybe, there were people still there, squatting, hiding, watching, waiting for someone like us to wander too close. As we pulled onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The military base loomed in the distance, shrouded in the fading light. And I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the ruins someone or something was still watching. It was a crisp day in early spring, the kind of day where you could feel the air still biting with the remnants of winter, but the sun was warm enough to trick you into thinking it was spring for real. I was 12 at the time, and my best friend, Emily, and I were exploring the woods behind her house. We did this all the time, making up games, pretending we were explorers in some remote jungle or wildlife photographers tracking rare species. We were just two kids full of energy, and the woods felt like our second home. Emily's house was on the edge of a small town, and behind it, the woods stretched for miles. We had spent hours in these woods before, climbing trees, searching for animal tracks, or just lying on our backs in a field, watching clouds drift by. That day, though, something felt different. We were walking along one of the familiar trails when Emily stopped. I nearly walked right into her. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed him. A man, dressed in worn-out Carhartt pants and a jacket, standing still about 300 yards away. He was looking in our direction, but he wasn't doing anything. He just stood there. He didn't move for a long time, and it made my stomach twist into knots. He looked out of place, like someone who didn't belong in these woods. "Should we go back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, but then nodded. "Let's just wait here for a minute. If he sees us, we'll know." So we ducked into the bushes nearby. The underbrush was thick with brambles and dead leaves, and it made hiding easier, but I felt my heart start to race. The man was still there, standing motionless, but he was so far away, it felt like he couldn't have seen us. We waited for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably just a minute. I kept my eyes on him the whole time. But suddenly, when I looked again, he was gone. I scanned the area but couldn't see him anywhere. "He must have left," Emily said, her voice lighter now that we didn't have to watch him anymore. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to argue. We started to walk back to the house, deciding it was probably best to head back just in case. We'd been in the woods for hours already, and we were both a little tired. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees, and I was eager to get back to the warmth of her house. Then we heard it. A loud, sharp gunshot echoed through the woods, followed by the sudden, jarring crack of leaves and twigs snapping underfoot. My heart skipped a beat. Did he just? I started to ask, but Emily was already pulling me by the sleeve. Run! Run! She screamed, her voice thick with panic. I didn't need any more convincing. My body was already in motion, my legs pumping, heart hammering in my chest. We took off, sprinting down the trail toward her house. But the sound of the gunshot was still ringing in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced back, but I didn't see the man. But then something even worse crossed my mind. How had he gotten so close so quickly? The snow, though mostly melted, still covered patches of the ground, mixed with dry leaves and brittle sticks. It crunched underfoot. The idea that someone could move that quickly through all that noise without making a sound didn't make sense. It didn't add up. We ran faster. Emily's breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear her crying beside me, but I didn't have time to comfort her. My focus was on getting us both to safety. I could feel my body pushing through exhaustion. I had been sick recently, still recovering, and my legs burned from the effort, but I couldn't stop. Another shot rang out, and I felt it more than heard it. It was too close, too loud. Emily cried out, and I felt her stumble behind me. My heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't dare look back this time. I just kept running, every instinct telling me to move faster, faster. We had to get to the house. The hill that led up to Emily's house was steep, and it felt like it took forever to climb. The woods were quiet now. The only sounds are heavy breathing, the pounding of our feet, and the distant rustle of trees. But then there was another shot. A third. I could hear the bullet slicing through the air, but I didn't know where it was coming from. By the time we reached the top of the hill, we were both panting, our legs giving out beneath us. I grabbed for the door handle, but as I turned, I caught something in the corner of my eye. I froze. He was standing there, out the window. The man, wearing his Carhartts, was at the edge of the woods, looking straight at me. His face was unreadable, but there was something about his stillness that felt too deliberate, too calculating. He made eye contact, and I felt my blood run cold. He didn't move, not even when I slammed the door shut behind me, not even when I fumbled with the lock, nearly tearing my fingers apart trying to turn it. Inside the garage, I almost passed out. I could feel the dizziness creeping in, the overwhelming exhaustion of the run combined with my lingering illness. My vision blurred, and I had to steady myself on the wall to keep from falling. But I couldn't stop now. I stumbled into the kitchen where Emily was standing with her parents. She was sobbing, trying to catch her breath, her face red and blotchy from fear. Her dad was talking to her, his voice low and urgent, but I couldn't make out the words. I felt sick, like everything around me was closing in. I had just come so close to being out there in those woods, alone with him. What the hell happened? Emily's dad asked, looking at me with wide, concerned eyes. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I could feel the weight of everything crashing down on me. The gunshots, the man's eyes, the way he had moved so fast. How had he done that? How had he been so close? Emily's dad grabbed his coat and went outside to check around the property. We were both crying now, the adrenaline and fear still pumping through our veins. Emily kept repeating, "He was right there, he was right there." Her dad came back inside after a few minutes, his face tight with concern. "He's gone," he said, his voice grave. "I couldn't find him anywhere. We'll call the cops." The police arrived soon after, but there was no sign of the man. The officer who came didn't make any noise. He didn't turn on his sirens or cause a scene. He parked down at a nearby gas station, trying not to alert the man in Carhartts that he was there. The officer patrolled the woods for hours that night, scanning the trees, checking the trails, and looking for anything suspicious. But they didn't find anything. Not a trace. It was like the man had disappeared into the woods without a sound. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way he had looked at me, the way he had moved so quickly, like he had known exactly where we were the whole time. I wondered if we'd just been lucky to make it back when we did. We never saw him again, not in the woods, not anywhere near her house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere. And the next time, he might not let us escape. The woods behind Emily's house felt different after that. What had once been a place of freedom, of adventure, suddenly felt too big, too dark. The branches seemed to reach out with cold, bony fingers. I never went back there, not the way we used to. The woods were no longer our playground. They had become a reminder of that terrifying day. And every time I think about it, I still hear the echo of that gunshot, as sharp and as clear as it was the moment I first heard it. We never spoke about it much after that night. It felt like one of those things we both knew we couldn't really explain, something that didn't make sense, but left us with a feeling that didn't go away. Sometimes, even now, I still wonder who he was, what he wanted, and why he never came back. But some things, I guess, are better left unanswered. I woke up in the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 a.m. I wasn't sure which one it was, but the sudden ringing of the doorbell jolted me out of sleep. My eyes snapped open, and I could feel my heart racing immediately. The sound echoed through the hallway, sharp and insistent, louder than I thought it should be for that time of night. It was enough to make me sit up in bed, disoriented, confused. I had just come back from a long day of work, and everything had been quiet until then. I was in my room, alone in my apartment, the kind of silence that makes everything feel still and almost too perfect. So when I heard the doorbell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was a family emergency. My extended family all lived in the same apartment block. I thought something had happened, and that maybe one of them needed help. My head was foggy, still in that half-dream state, but my heart was pounding in my chest, pulling me out of bed. I fumbled around on my nightstand for my glasses, but they weren't there. The panic was starting to build. I couldn't see clearly, but I thought I heard something else now. A faint rustling outside my door, like someone shifting nervously. But there was no time for that. The doorbell rang again, this time sharper, almost more frantic. Without thinking, I pulled myself out of bed and hurried toward the door. The apartment felt colder now, the kind of cold that settles in when you wake up suddenly, still half lost in sleep. I rushed down the hallway, trying not to trip over my own feet. The apartment wasn't large, but everything felt so much further when you were half asleep, like your limbs weren't cooperating. I reached the door, still blinking from the sleep in my eyes, and I grabbed the handle. My mind was already running through possible scenarios. What if it's a neighbor who needs something? Maybe an emergency. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt urgent. I swung the door open, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, silent and still. No footsteps. No shadow in the dim light from the hallway. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The doorbell rang again. I flinched, and the blood drained from my face. The sound was coming from the hallway, still echoing, but there was no one standing at my door. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. It had to be some sort of hallucination. Maybe I was half dreaming still. I'd heard stories of people waking up to strange sounds, like bells or knocks, only to realize later that it was just their mind playing tricks. I'd read about it in articles, seen it in movies. This kind of thing could happen, right? I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus, and as I started to close the door, I froze. The doorbell rang again, but this time I was fully awake, no longer in that in-between state. I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't chalk it up to an overactive imagination anymore. The ringing was real. I stood there for a moment, listening intently. The sound of the bell rang through my apartment again, but there was something else now. A faint, sharp clicking sound that followed the bell. I knew that sound. It was the sound the lock made when someone was trying to force a key into it. But no one had been at my door long enough to even touch the lock. The moment I heard that noise, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly yanked the door open again, heart pounding. There was no one, but I heard footsteps. Someone was running down the hallway, their shoes slapping against the floor as they sprinted away from my door. I didn't see anyone, but I knew someone was there. My mind raced, my thoughts scrambled. Was it a burglar? Or someone just messing with me? I hesitated for a moment, trying to gather my wits. Then I stuck my head out into the hallway. I couldn't see much in the dim light, and without my glasses, everything was a blur. But I knew there was someone running, and I could hear their footsteps fading fast. My instincts told me to chase them, but I stopped myself. What if it was nothing? What if it was just someone with the wrong address? My mind kept going back to that sound, the doorbell, the lock. It wasn't just my imagination. I pulled the door closed behind me and stood there for a few more seconds, listening. The hallway was quiet now, almost too quiet. I could hear the hum of the building's pipes, the faint buzz of a distant light. I wanted to go back to bed, but my mind wouldn't let me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Just as I turned to walk back to my room, the doorbell rang again. That familiar, unnerving sound echoed down the hallway. I felt my blood run cold. This time, I didn't hesitate. I marched back to the door and yanked it open with more force than I meant to. "Can I help you?" I demanded, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the silence. I stood there, breathing hard, but there was no one there. Nothing but the empty hallway. I was about to step back inside when I heard it again. The sound of running footsteps, fast and frantic. I felt the same dread crawling up my spine, but this time, I didn't just stand there. I peered down the hallway, straining my eyes, and saw a figure darting around the corner. They were too fast for me to make out any details, just a shadow, someone moving with purpose. I froze for a moment, too stunned to react. My heart was still pounding, my breath coming in short bursts. What was happening? I stood there for a long moment, still gripping the door handle. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then, almost in disbelief, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. What was I supposed to do now? The doorbell rang again, this time the sound seeming to come from right outside the door. No more running. No more sounds of someone scrambling away. Just the bell, ringing again and again. I opened the door one last time, and this time, when I looked outside, there was a man standing there, his face flushed, looking like he had just sprinted down the hallway. He was panting heavily, and I could see he was a little disoriented, his eyes wide with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice apologetic but breathless. "I think I've got the wrong unit. I'm visiting a friend in the building, and I think I've mixed up the numbers." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. All of the tension, the fear, everything I had been feeling, evaporated in an instant. I couldn't help but feel a little foolish, standing there in the hallway in the middle of the night, my heart still pounding, while this guy was just trying to find his friend. "That's okay," I said, still feeling a little off kilter. I know the building's a bit confusing with the numbering system. I couldn't really blame him. The building had a weird layout, with units that didn't always make sense, and it was easy to get lost. It was just one of those things. Still, my pulse didn't slow down immediately. The adrenaline from the situation had to burn itself out, and I stood there for a moment, catching my breath. The man gave me a quick nod, looking even more embarrassed now. He turned and hurried down the hallway, and I watched him go, just wanting to get back to bed and forget all about it. The whole thing had been such a bizarre experience, and I couldn't believe how worked up I'd gotten over something so simple. I didn't even care anymore. I closed the door, locked it behind me, and turned off the lights in the hallway. The sound of the doorbell seemed like a distant memory now, and everything slowly returned to silence. I crawled back into bed, my heart still racing a little, but at least now I had an explanation for everything. Just some confused guest who'd gotten lost in the building. Nothing dangerous, nothing supernatural, just a momentary scare. But even as I finally tried to settle into sleep, my mind kept playing over the sound of the doorbell, the strange jiggling of the lock. I wondered, for a second, how many other people had heard that same sound in the building. Maybe they had their own stories too. Maybe next time, I'd make sure to double-check the apartment numbers before answering the door. I live maybe a 5-minute walk from a massive forest that stretches across 2 counties. It's the kind of place where you can get lost easily if you're not careful, and I've spent my entire life in its shadow. For as long as I can remember, my family has had this almost superstitious relationship with the place. We believe in things that most people would call myths, like fairies and spirits. These old beliefs run deep, and they're as much a part of our family as anything else. We respect the forest. We follow its rules. And above all, we never question its strange ways. My mom has always wanted to make it to the top of the mountain that sits at the heart of that forest. She's tried countless times, but each time she comes back frustrated, claiming she couldn't find a way up. I'd never really understood why it was so hard, but I decided I would try to find the path for myself. Maybe I could do what she couldn't. I'd leave early in the morning, and by the time I was done, I'd be back before dark. That was the plan. I didn't tell my mom right away. I figured I'd just go on my own, give it a shot, and see what happened. I grabbed my dog. She's a mutt, but she's been with me since she was a pup. She's always been protective, and honestly, I'd feel safer with her than alone. We'd do this walk together, and she would keep me company along the way. I've walked through that forest more times than I can count, but today was different. Right from the start, something felt off. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd seen other people on the trail before, and that day was no different. There was a steady stream of folks coming and going, heading up and down the paths. But after about an hour of walking, I noticed something strange. It was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, the forest is filled with sounds. You've got the calls of birds in the trees, the rustling of leaves as animals scurry around, the distant bark of dogs from the nearby farms. But none of that. Not today. The silence was unnerving. At first, I thought maybe it was just the time of day, or maybe something had scared the animals off. But the more I walked, the more the stillness made my skin crawl. My dog was acting a little strange too, her ears flicking at every little sound, every little movement. She was on edge, just like me. There's an old rule in my family that we follow religiously when we're in the forest. Never turn around to look behind you. The reasoning behind it is simple but eerie. The story goes that if you turn around, you'll see something you shouldn't, something that will follow you. And once it starts, you can't stop. The more you look, the more it will haunt you. So, even though the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, I didn't dare glance behind me. I kept walking forward, trying to push the feeling out of my mind. Another hour passed, and I was deep into the forest now, the trees thick around me. I didn't see a single person along the path. No one. I should have expected it. It wasn't uncommon to be alone on these trails, but for some reason, it felt odd today. My mind kept wandering back to the silence, the stillness. The trees seemed to press in a little too tightly around me, the air too thick. Even the ground felt off, soft, like it had been disturbed, but in a way that didn't make sense. When I finally made it to the top of the mountain, I was both relieved and unsettled. The view from the summit was breathtaking. You could see miles of open fields and the distant town in the valley below. The landscape was peaceful, untouched. It was everything I had hoped for, but as I stood there soaking it all in, I realized something. My dog was nowhere to be seen. This was the first time in all our walks together that she had wandered off like this. She never left my side, not ever. It didn't make sense. I called her name, over and over, panic creeping into my voice. I was frantic, looking around the area, calling louder. But there was no answer, just the wind and the distant rustling of trees. I didn't know what to do. I started walking back down the mountain, hoping to find her along the way. I had no service on my phone, so I couldn't even call my mom to tell her what was happening. I searched for what felt like an hour, yelling for her until my voice cracked. But still nothing. No sign of her anywhere. My heart was racing. I sat down on a large rock and buried my head in my hands, trying to think. I had no idea where to go or how to find her. That's when I felt it, a lick on my hand. I looked up, and there she was. My dog was sitting beside me, as if nothing had happened. She looked at me with those big brown eyes, tail wagging like she had been there the entire time. But that wasn't possible. I hadn't heard her. I hadn't seen her. It was like she had just materialized out of thin air. I didn't question it right then. I couldn't. I just grabbed her leash and started heading back down the mountain. My thoughts were a mess, trying to piece together what had just happened. But the further I walked, the more I realized something else. I was lost. Completely lost. I'd been walking for hours, but I had no idea which way I had come from. The path was unfamiliar, the landscape different from what I had seen on the way up. I tried to stay calm, but fear was setting in. I looked around, trying to figure out where I was, but everything was beginning to blur. The trees seemed to close in, making the path feel narrower and narrower. I was in a part of the forest I didn't recognize, an area I had never seen before. The forest stretched on endlessly in every direction. That's when I heard it, the rustling in the bushes. It was loud, like something, or someone was moving through the underbrush, something big. I froze, every muscle tensing. My heart thudded in my chest. I turned around slowly, trying to see what it was. At first, I couldn't make out anything in the thick trees. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A deer. At least, that's what I thought it was at first. But this was no ordinary deer. It was huge, towering over me, easily 3 times the size of any deer I had ever seen. The creature's body was twisted, its legs bent at odd angles, joints contorted in ways that defied nature. Its eyes, they were wrong. Sunken in, dark and lifeless, like they had rotted from the inside out. It didn't move, not at first, just stared at me with those empty eyes. I took a step back, and it stepped forward, its head jerking up at the movement. The rustling intensified, and I knew I had to get away. I didn't even think. I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, pushing through the underbrush, my dog at my side. But the further I ran, the more disoriented I became. The forest had changed. The path I thought I was on wasn't the path anymore. I ran for what felt like forever, until my breath was ragged and my legs were burning. My inhaler, my only lifeline in situations like this, was in my pocket, and I pulled it out, desperate to catch my breath. I sat down on a fallen log, my mind racing. What was happening? How had I gotten so lost? I looked around, trying to make sense of the forest. That's when I noticed it. I had come to a fork in the trail. One way was darker, the trees thicker, the path more overgrown. The other way seemed more open, a little clearer. I didn't trust the dark path. Something about it felt wrong, like it was pulling me in, like I wasn't supposed to go there. So I chose the other way, hoping it would lead me home. The moment I stepped onto the new path, something shifted. It was like the air changed. The forest seemed to whisper, like the trees were talking to each other, warning me. I didn't know what it meant, but I followed the path, trying to push the unease from my mind. I walked quickly, eager to get out, but the further I went, the stranger things became. Eventually, I came to a clearing, and I thought I recognized it. I could see the open field ahead, the one I had passed on the way up. But when I turned around, everything had changed. The dense forest I had just walked through wasn't there anymore. It had transformed into something else, something unrecognizable. The trees were no longer the same, no longer the familiar ones I had seen earlier. They were taller, darker, and their branches twisted in unnatural ways. I didn't understand. How had I gotten here? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized something else. I wasn't just lost in the forest. I was lost in something much bigger. The forest had changed the moment I had turned onto that new path. I kept walking, not stopping until I finally made it back home, my heart still racing. When I sat down with my mom and told her everything, she looked at me with wide eyes, as though she already knew what had happened. She said the forest was angry that day, and it had taken its toll on me. The forest had a way of punishing those who trespassed, who didn't respect its rules. I didn't know if I believed her or not, but I did know this. I would never go back up that mountain alone again. Not ever. The forest had shown me something I couldn't explain, something I would never forget. I had seen its darker side, and I knew now that the stories were more than just stories. The forest had its own secrets, and I had come too close to uncovering them. I haven't walked up to the top of that mountain without someone else since. It's not the freakiest thing that's ever happened to me, but it's the one that haunts me the most. Because deep down, I know that the forest is still out there, waiting, and it knows when you're there, whether you see it or not. I worked security during college to pay the bills. It was a strange mix of boring and unsettling, but it was always a job, and I could make good money. One of the sites I worked at was this old, decrepit factory. It wasn't just any factory, though. This place used to make pantyhose. Yeah, nylon stockings. Some people like to joke about it and call it the pantyhose factory whenever we were on our break. It wasn't particularly funny, but it was a nice way to kill time, and that factory was a gold mine of weirdness. The building itself was massive. It was crumbling in places, and the windows were covered with grime, half of them broken. It was the kind of place that felt like it could fall apart if the wind blew too hard. There were these long hallways that stretched for what felt like miles, and some of the rooms were left untouched for decades. Most of the time, I'd just check in on the office area, make sure the security cameras were working, and take my rounds through the empty parts of the building. But there was this one hallway that made my skin crawl, no matter how many times I walked it. I'd heard the stories. Everyone had one. They talked about the swamp woman who haunted the factory. I couldn't tell you who started it, but I remember hearing about her from the first day I started. They said she was the ghost of a worker who died under mysterious circumstances, but no one could really agree on how it happened. Some people claimed she'd been killed in an accident while working on one of the machines. Others swore she drowned in the swamp behind the factory and came back to haunt the place. The stories ranged from playful to terrifying. There were reports of workers getting hit with bags full of pantyhose, like someone was tossing them at them from the shadows. They'd see a light flicker and follow it, only to have it disappear when they got close. Doors would open and close for no reason, and lights would turn off on their own. Some people even claimed they saw figures moving in the dark, but nobody ever really said they were scared. It was always like, "Oh, that's just the swamp woman again." It was like a running joke, one of those things people laughed off but secretly had doubts about. But after a while, I started to think there was something to it. And I got to tell you, there's a feeling you get in certain places. You can't explain it, but you know when something's wrong. I started feeling it more and more at the factory, especially during the late-night shifts when I was walking the plant by myself. One night, I was making my usual rounds, trudging through the empty factory. The building was completely silent, except for the hum of the old ventilation system and the occasional creak from the floorboards. It was the kind of eerie quiet that made you hyper-aware of your every step. The lights above buzzed every now and then, and the shadows seemed to stretch out farther than usual. The hallways, especially the long ones, felt like they went on forever. The walls were so close you could almost feel them leaning in. It felt like you were walking in a tunnel with no way out. No doors, no windows. Just endless concrete and flickering lights. I was making my way down one of those hallways when I felt it. This strange tug on the back of my shirt. It wasn't gentle or playful like the stories I'd heard about the swamp woman. This was forceful, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I froze. My heart skipped. It wasn't the wind. There were no drafts in the building. It wasn't another worker either, because I was alone in that part of the factory. I spun around, adrenaline flooding my system, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. Nothing at all. I felt my stomach drop. My skin felt cold and tight. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me, but there was nothing there. I could almost hear my pulse in my ears, thumping faster as I stood there. There's that moment, that split second of decision. You want to chalk it up to imagination, to brush it off. You want to say, I'm just being paranoid. There's nothing here. But the thing is, I couldn't do that. There was something about that feeling, something that told me I wasn't just being paranoid. Something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I looked down the hallway again. The shadows seemed to press closer to the walls. The silence felt deeper. It's hard to explain, but everything in that moment felt wrong. So, I turned and walked back the way I came, faster this time, trying not to look over my shoulder. My steps echoed in the empty space. I didn't want to go any further into the building. I didn't even want to finish my rounds. But you can't just leave a building like that in the middle of your shift. I had a job to do. So I kept walking, but my senses were heightened now. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, made my heart race. And then, as I reached the end of the hallway, I felt it again. Another tug on my shirt tail. This one was stronger, more insistent. I whipped around, ready to confront whatever it was. Nothing. Nothing at all. I was shaking. My mind raced. My gut told me to run. I didn't know what it was, but I knew something was wrong. Something that couldn't be explained by the usual factory noises or my overactive imagination. I made my way out of that hallway and back to the main office. I don't even know if I was breathing normally anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest. The air felt thick and suffocating. The last thing I wanted to do was stay in that building another minute longer. I didn't even finish my rounds that night. I just got in my car, locked the doors, and sat there in the parking lot, glaring at the building. The factory loomed in front of me like a giant, dark monster. I wasn't afraid of ghosts. I never really believed in them. But that night, I didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the stories catching up to me. Or maybe it was just the weirdness of the whole situation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that building. The next few days, I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, that it was nothing. Maybe the fabric of the building was just settling, or maybe I had caught my shirt on something. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just imagining it. Something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I never went back to that factory for my regular shifts after that. They moved me to another site, and I didn't even hesitate to take it. I've worked plenty of strange places, but that factory, it was different. People still joke about the swamp woman, about the ghost of the pantyhose factory, but I never found any of it funny. I don't know if it was a ghost or if it was just the weirdness of the old building, but the next time I'm asked about it, I'll just shake my head. I don't know what happened that night. I just know I don't ever want to find out again. But I'm telling you, after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in there wasn't done with me. Even now, every time I pass by that old factory, I get that same uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it's all just in my head, but I'd rather not take the chance to find out. I wasn't planning on walking that night. I'd been home most of the day, stuck in one of those restless moods where nothing on TV held my attention. My phone felt more like a brick than entertainment, and my thoughts were just bouncing around in my head too loud to ignore. I didn't feel like talking to anyone, didn't want to go anywhere with people. I just needed to be alone, but not inside. So, even though it was already getting dark, I grabbed a hoodie, slipped on my sneakers, and headed out the door. There's this patch of woods about 20 minutes from my house. They're not deep woods, not the kind that go on for miles or anything like that. Just a stretch of trees between neighborhoods, maybe a little bigger than a golf course, with a few narrow trails that wind through it. I'd only been in there once before, and even then I'd stuck to the main path during the day. But that night, I thought it would be quiet, peaceful even. Just some fresh air and a walk to clear my head. The walk to the woods wasn't bad. The air was cool, that late night kind of damp chill that comes just before a storm, but hadn't quite started yet. The streets were mostly empty, just a few porch lights on, the occasional car in the distance. When I reached the edge of the woods, it was already darker than I expected, and the tree canopy didn't help. It was one of those nights where the sky felt heavy low, like it was pressing down on everything. Still, I felt okay as I stepped onto the path. The trail was mostly dirt and packed leaves, narrow and a little overgrown. I could hear the wind in the branches above, a constant creaking and swaying sound, and dry leaves scraping against each other. I turned on my phone flashlight, which wasn't great, but enough to light a small circle ahead of me. It gave me maybe 5 or 6 feet of visibility in front. Everything beyond that was just black shapes and shifting shadows. About 10 minutes into the walk, the rain started. At first it was just a few drops, big cold ones that tapped on my hood and soaked through the thin fabric. Then, almost instantly, it became a full-on downpour. The kind of rain that doesn't ease in. It just slams down, like someone opened a valve above my head. The wind kicked up too, fast and biting. It whipped through the trees and pushed the rain sideways, slamming it into my face no matter which way I turned. I tried pulling my hood tighter, but it didn't help much. I was soaked within a minute. I kept walking, not really sure where I was going now. The trail had forked a few times, and I hadn't really paid attention. I figured if I just kept moving forward, I'd eventually hit the edge of the woods. But I hadn't expected the storm, and with everything now wet and slick and visibility so low, the paths were blending together. Everything looked the same, muddy dark, trees that seemed to crowd closer with every step. The worst part wasn't the rain or even the cold. It was how disoriented I started to feel. The wind kept howling through the trees, shaking branches overhead so hard I kept thinking something was moving just above me. A few times, something snapped in the distance, branches falling, maybe, but every crack or rustle felt too close, like someone was walking just out of reach. I would shine my phone toward the sound and see nothing but tree trunks and a haze of rain. After a while, I started to feel something else, this heavy, growing sense of dread. It wasn't panic, not at first. Just a low, gnawing feeling in my gut. Like something wasn't right. Like I shouldn't be there. It didn't make sense. I mean, I knew it was just a walk through the woods during a bad storm. But I couldn't shake the sensation that the trees were pressing in, that the path behind me had disappeared, and the forest was slowly swallowing me. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to just keep going. I aimed my phone light forward and pushed ahead, ignoring how fast my heart was beating. The path dipped a little and then started to rise. That was when I realized I must be getting close to the railway. There's an old, slightly raised track that cuts through this part of town. Still active, but not used very often. I remembered that on the far side of the track, there was a field, and beyond that were the streets that led straight back to my house. That gave me some relief, at least enough to keep moving. The trail curved sharply, and suddenly the woods opened up. I saw the faint shape of the rail line just ahead, the gravel-covered embankment, and the steel rails wet and glinting in the rain. My shoes were already soaked, but crossing that muddy slope to reach the tracks made it worse. My foot sank nearly to the ankle at one point, and I nearly slipped on one of the slick wooden ties. As I reached the middle of the track, I paused. Just out of habit, I looked left and right, though I knew no train would be coming through in this storm. That's when I saw it. To my left, just under the shadow of the bridge where the track passed over a drainage ditch, I saw a figure hanging. It was only visible for a second, maybe two. The combination of my phone light and the faint orange glow of distant streetlights created just enough contrast to make it out. It looked like a man, still limp, swaying slightly. His feet weren't touching the ground. His head was tilted forward, neck bent in a way that looked wrong. I could see something stretched from above, possibly a rope, though it was hard to tell with the rain streaking down my face and my light barely cutting through the dark. My heart stopped. Not just skipped, but stopped cold. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring, completely frozen. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a branch, something hanging from the bridge. But it had looked too real, too solid, too human. Then it was gone. Just like that, nothing. I blinked, wiped rain from my eyes, and aimed my phone again. All I saw was the underside of the bridge, dark and dripping with rainwater. No shape, no figure, just empty space and a wall of graffiti. I don't remember moving. I just remember suddenly being across the tracks, my shoes slipping on wet gravel, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. I ran. Didn't care about the mud, the cold, the rain. I cut through the field, stumbling over uneven ground, nearly twisting my ankle on a hidden dip, but I didn't stop until I reached the sidewalk at the far end. I must have looked like a mess. Drenched head to toe, hair plastered to my forehead, hoodie clinging to my skin, shoes squelching with every step. But I didn't stop until I was home. I stripped down in the laundry room, left my soaked clothes in a pile, and wrapped myself in a towel. My hands were trembling. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that I was stressed, tired, the weather was messing with my senses. Maybe a branch caught in some wires, or a shadow that happened to fall just right. Maybe my brain filled in the rest. I didn't believe it, but I kept telling myself that anyway. After I warmed up and dried off, I sat down, still shaken, but trying to let it go. That's when I remembered something. One of my friends had mentioned the bridge before. Not seriously, just in passing. Said it was a creepy spot, and that people hung out there sometimes to smoke or drink. I figured he meant teenagers doing stupid things, not anything serious. But I couldn't get that image out of my head. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I talked to that friend again, just casually brought it up, not expecting much. When I mentioned the hanging shape I thought I saw, his expression changed. He got real quiet. Then he told me something I didn't know. A few years ago, someone had actually hanged themselves under that bridge. A man in his early 30s, I think. Local. He was found early one morning by a train engineer. Apparently, he had gone missing a day or two before, and that was where he ended up. The city cleaned it up, of course, but it wasn't something that ever made headlines. Just a quiet tragedy no one wanted to talk about. My friend then told me, kind of hesitantly, that he'd seen the same thing I described, almost word for word. Said he was out there one night with a couple other guys, just smoking and hanging out near the bridge. When he looked up, he swore he saw a man hanging, just for a second. Then nothing. His friends didn't see it, or at least they didn't say anything. He figured it was just the weed or the shadows messing with his head. But after hearing my story, he looked a little spooked. I don't know what to make of it. I'm not saying I saw a ghost or anything like that. I don't believe in that stuff, not really. Maybe it was some subconscious thing. My brain remembered what he'd said before and filled in the blanks in a moment of stress. Maybe we both saw the same illusion, our minds playing tricks under the same conditions. Rain, dark, fear. It's all possible. All I know is that I saw something that night. Something that felt too real to be imagined. And even if it wasn't there physically, something in those woods, something on that bridge, left an impression. The kind that doesn't fade, no matter how many times you tell yourself it was just a trick of the light. I haven't gone back to those woods since. Not during the day. Not at night. Not even when it's sunny. It's not that I think something will happen. I just don't want to feel that dread again. That cold, creeping sensation that wraps around your spine and makes you feel like you're not alone, even when no one's there. I've walked a lot of places at night before, but never like that. That night changed something in me. I still walk when I get restless, still wander around the neighborhood sometimes. But I stick to the streets now, where the lights are on and the paths are clear, and there's no need for a flashlight to see what's in front of me. It was around the time I started getting older, just old enough to understand the little rituals my parents had, that I began to wonder why my mom always ended my dad's calls with the same words every night. Every night without fail. She would always say, "See you soon, lock your doors." I heard it more times than I could count, but back then I never thought much of it. It was just something she did, something that seemed so normal to her. And I guess I thought it was a kind of quirky thing, like the way she always checked the front door twice before bed, or made sure every light was off before turning in. It was just her way of being cautious. But as I grew older, I started to realize that there was something more to it. It was my dad's job that kept him on late shifts. He worked in a factory, usually getting off work around 10:30 p.m. Most nights, I didn't even see him before he left, but I'd hear him on the phone as he was getting ready to head out. I would hear him talking to my mom, always just a few minutes of small talk, nothing too serious. It was just that same routine, him heading out, her wishing him safe travels, reminding him to lock his doors. At the time, I never thought twice about it. It wasn't until I was old enough to understand the deeper meaning behind those words that my parents finally told me the story. I remember the day so clearly. I must have been about 15 or 16, and it was a Saturday. The sky was starting to turn that dull shade of evening, the kind of twilight that makes everything seem far too quiet. I had just finished my chores and was sitting at the kitchen table when my dad came in from the living room, his face looking a little grimmer than usual. He didn't say much at first, just sat down across from me. My mom, who had been bustling around the kitchen, setting out dinner, noticed his expression and paused. The moment she saw him, her face softened. I don't think she said anything, but I could feel the tension rise between them, that kind of silent understanding that happens when you've lived with someone for so long. That's when my dad spoke up. "You know why I always make sure to lock my doors?" he asked. It was an odd way to begin, and for a moment I didn't understand. I had heard that phrase so many times before, but I didn't think there was any significance to it. But then he looked at me, his face tight, as if he was bracing for something. "It's because one night I didn't." He went on to tell me the story. The first part was just like any other night. He had worked his shift, same as always, the factory buzzing with the usual sounds of machines and the low hum of conversations that seemed to fade into the background. The night had been slow, with little to keep him occupied except his thoughts. He was tired, ready to get home and settle into the routine of the night. Lock the doors, check the windows, maybe watch the news for a little bit, and then go to bed. His phone call with my mom had been the usual. "See you soon, lock your doors," she had said. Nothing out of the ordinary. But this night, the drive home felt different. The roads were dark, with only the glow of his headlights cutting through the blackness. He lived in a semi-rural area, a long stretch of road lined with thick trees and fields that looked like they went on forever. There wasn't much traffic that time of night, and the few cars that were out mostly stuck to their own lane. Not much for him to worry about. It was the stoplight that changed everything. He was approaching the intersection at a calm pace, his eyes flicking to the red light ahead of him. He was already half focused on what he was going to do when he got home. As he slowed, something caught his attention, a shadow, a figure moving just outside his peripheral vision. He didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a person walking along the side of the road, he thought. But it wasn't. The figure was walking too steadily, almost too confidently, for someone out for a late-night stroll. As the light turned red, he came to a complete stop. And then, out of nowhere, the passenger side door was flung open. My dad froze, not really processing what was happening. And before he could even react, a man had slipped into the seat next to him. There was nothing normal about the situation. The man didn't say anything. He didn't make a move to threaten my dad, but what he did do was hold a machete in his lap, casually as though it was the most normal thing in the world. My dad couldn't remember exactly how long the silence lasted, but it felt like an eternity. The man just sat there, the machete resting on his knee. His hands were visibly empty. My dad could hear his own breathing, shallow and confused. The only thing he could think to do was ask, "Are you okay?" It was a stupid question, now that I think about it, but in that moment, my dad was just trying to make sense of it. The guy didn't answer. He didn't move. He just sat there, as if he were waiting for something. It wasn't like in the movies, where a guy with a weapon demands money or makes threats. No, this man just sat there in complete, eerie silence. My dad, still in shock, did the only thing that seemed reasonable in that moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, sliding it over to the guy without a word. The man took the wallet, his eyes never leaving my dad's face. Then, without a single word spoken, the man opened the door, stepped out, and walked off into the night. My dad stayed sitting there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. He checked his wallet. It was gone, but at least he was unharmed. The man didn't seem like he was after my dad's life, just whatever was in his wallet. But it was the weird, unsettling way he acted that haunted my dad for a long time after. No words, no threats, just silent, menacing calm. My dad couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he hadn't given the guy his wallet. Would the man have just left? Or would things have escalated? He would never know. My dad didn't call the police that night. He didn't think it would do any good. By the time he would have gotten home and reported it, the man would have been long gone. The police wouldn't have had anything to go on. It was just a strange encounter, something that didn't make sense in any way. And my dad kept it to himself for a while, not wanting to worry my mom or make a bigger deal out of it than it needed to be. But that's when he started locking his doors every night. When he pulled into the driveway, the first thing he did was lock all the doors. No exceptions. It became a ritual, just like his late-night phone call to my mom, just like the way my mom always reminded him to lock the doors. He wasn't taking any chances anymore. Not after that night. I had always wondered why my mom said those words, why it felt so important to her. But after hearing my dad's story, I understood completely. It wasn't about being paranoid. It was about staying safe in a world where things didn't always make sense. I started doing the same thing myself. Every time I get into my car at night, I triple-check the locks. I don't care if it's just a quick trip to the store or a drive down the block. I don't trust that everything will be fine just because it seems like it will be. After hearing that story, I never wanted to be caught off guard, not like my dad was. I don't know what the man wanted that night. My dad never got an answer, and that's what haunts me the most. Why did he just sit there with the machete in his lap? What could have happened if my dad hadn't given him the wallet? There are a lot of questions that will never be answered, and I think that's what makes it so unsettling. I've been driving for a few years now, and I still remember that story every time I pull into the driveway late at night. And every time, I make sure to lock the doors. I had just turned 17 when I got my first job as a cart associate at a large retail chain that rhymed with Talwart. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent enough for someone still in high school. Working the night shift wasn't too bad, quiet, peaceful, not a lot of customers. Most nights, it was just me and a couple of other associates filling carts and pushing them into the designated bays. It was a good routine, except for those nights when the store got busy, and I ended up having to rush around trying to keep up. On the night this strange thing happened, I was working in one of the smaller cart bays while my two co-workers, Greg and Mike, handled the larger bay. It was one of those nights where the store was a little busier than usual, so I found myself behind schedule, pushing carts in as quickly as I could. I had about an hour's work left to finish up my side of the store, and I was starting to get a little frustrated by how behind I was. Greg came over to check on my progress. He must have seen how much work I still had left to do, so he offered to help me out. "Don't worry about it, I'll catch up with you," he said. "I'll grab the carts from the corrals, and you can just put them on the machine." Greg always had a laid-back attitude, but that was probably one of the reasons I liked working with him. We quickly got to work, Greg grabbing the carts, me placing them on the machine. In half an hour, we had the bay filled up and ready to go. Feeling pretty accomplished, we decided to head over to help Mike with his side of the store. As we walked towards the larger bay, we were halfway there when I saw a man walking towards us from the dark corner of the parking lot. It wasn't unusual for people to be hanging around the store after hours, but this guy stood out. He looked rough. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he had this disheveled look about him. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just another person looking to buy something. But the way he was holding the small cardboard box under his arm caught my attention. It was like he was cradling it protectively, almost like it was something valuable, and that made me uneasy. As he approached, I glanced at Greg. I could tell he felt the same unease. It wasn't every day you saw someone in that kind of condition hanging around at this time of night. I wasn't sure what the guy was going to ask, but it felt like the kind of situation where I was just waiting for some kind of weird proposition. I didn't know why, but it felt like we were about to be asked to buy something strange. Sure enough, as the man got closer, he spoke. "Do you want to buy some baby fetuses?" His voice wasn't loud, but there was something about it that just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't sure if I heard him right at first. Greg and I just stared at him for a second, processing what he had said. Sorry, but no thanks," I responded, trying to keep things polite but also confused and uncomfortable. But the man wasn't done. Instead of just moving on, he insisted. "Are you sure? You at least want to check him out." He shifted the cardboard box under his arm and opened it slowly, like he was revealing something precious. At this point, Greg and I shared another look, both of us kind of frozen, not knowing what to say or do. Something about the situation felt off, like we were in some kind of weird, bad movie. Despite the unease, curiosity got the best of us. Maybe it was the fact that we weren't exactly sure how serious this guy was, or maybe it was just the sheer weirdness of the moment. But we both leaned in slightly to get a better look into the box. The streetlight near the entrance of the store was about 20 feet away, so the light was kind of dim. We could barely make out the shapes in the box at first, but as our eyes adjusted, we could see what looked like fetuses. Small, deformed-looking things, wrapped in something slimy. The kind of thing you only see in weird horror movies or disturbing articles you stumble across on the internet. For a second, we just stood there, our minds racing. Were they real? Were they rubber? It was hard to tell in the low light, but they looked so disturbingly real, like something I shouldn't be seeing in person. The fetuses were arranged in rows inside the box, their little limbs twisted in strange angles. The sight made me feel physically ill, my stomach turning. It was hard to breathe, like the air around me had thickened. I could see Greg's face, and he looked as pale as I felt. I didn't know what to say or what to do. The guy was standing there, still holding the box open, waiting for us to respond. "Are you sure you don't want to buy them?" he asked again, almost pleading. I couldn't take it anymore. My throat was dry, and my heart was racing. I don't have any money on me," I said quickly, trying to get away from this situation. Greg chimed in, agreeing with me. "Yeah, I don't either," he said, almost too quickly. The guy didn't seem to mind that excuse, but it didn't end there. "All right," he said, his voice softening. "But do you want to touch them?" That question was the last straw. I could see Greg's eyes widen, and I felt the panic start to rise in my chest. This was just wrong. There was something deeply unsettling about the whole situation, and the guy's insistence only made it worse. Neither of us said anything. We both just turned away, not wanting to engage any further. We started to walk away from him, muttering something about, "Have a good night." But the guy wasn't done. As we walked, he called after us, "They're only rubber anyway." And then he turned and walked off in the opposite direction, his footsteps fading into the night. I don't know why, but I felt this overwhelming need to just get out of there. I didn't feel safe anymore. Something about that whole exchange didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just experienced something I wasn't supposed to. My hands were shaking as I walked back towards the other end of the parking lot, and I could hear Greg behind me, his footsteps quick and deliberate, matching my pace. When we met up with Mike, I don't think either of us mentioned what happened right away. We just kept pushing the carts into the bay, trying to ignore the unease that lingered in the pit of our stomachs. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. What had that guy wanted? Were they real? Was it some kind of weird joke? Or was he seriously trying to sell us something that shouldn't exist in the first place? The images of those slimy things stayed with me, flashing in my mind whenever I closed my eyes. The rest of the night felt like a blur, and I didn't feel comfortable walking around the parking lot by myself after that. Every shadow seemed like it was hiding something, every noise a potential threat. I kept my distance from the other associates, too, not wanting to tell anyone the full story. I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting, or worse, crazy. In the end, I never found out who that guy was, and I don't think I'll ever forget that moment. The unsettling way he held the box, the way he kept pushing us to touch the fetuses, the strange, almost casual way he spoke about them. I still can't figure out what his deal was, and I probably never will. Maybe he was just a mentally disturbed person with a sick sense of humor, or maybe he was trying to sell something to the highest bidder. But whatever it was, I don't think I'll ever forget that night, or the feeling that something wasn't quite right about what happened. To this day, I wonder if the fetuses were real, or if they were just rubber. I can't be sure, but the image of them haunts me every so often. What I do know is that I've never looked at cardboard boxes the same way again, and I've never wanted to be alone in a parking lot at night ever since. I used to work at a small, local museum with my husband. We ran the place ourselves. There weren't any other employees, so it was just us doing everything: cleaning, setting up exhibits, dealing with visitors. The building was old, really old, and had a strange vibe to it. It wasn't the kind of place that gave you a warm, cozy feeling when you walked through the doors. Instead, it felt like it was always watching you. I hated being there alone at night. The museum was in an old building that had been around since the 1800s. It had a long history, with many different types of businesses occupying it over the years. It had started as a theater, then became a butcher shop, a hardware store, and a few other things before being turned into a museum. It had a lot of character, lots of creaky floors, narrow hallways, and weird little nooks. The building had a particular smell, a mix of old wood, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. It always gave me the chills. There were parts of the building that always felt darker, even in broad daylight. But what really creeped me out the most was the elevator. We had this old, beat-up elevator right in front of our office. It was the kind of elevator that probably hadn't been serviced in years. It was the kind of thing you'd find in an old apartment building, something with a metal grate that you had to pull open manually. The doors weren't automatic, so whenever someone came down from the upstairs, they'd have to pull them open themselves. But here's the thing, sometimes the doors would open by themselves with no one around. It wasn't just a random malfunction either. The elevator would be completely empty, and we'd watch the button light up, turning orange as if someone was pressing it from the inside. The doors would open, and the elevator would either go up or down, depending on where it was supposed to be. It was always unsettling to see that. We'd be sitting in our office, working on paperwork or answering emails, and then the elevator doors would suddenly creak open. At first, I thought maybe it was just an issue with the mechanism, but after a while, it started to feel intentional, like someone or something was using the elevator. That was bad enough, but sometimes we'd hear voices coming from inside the elevator when the doors opened. It was faint, just barely audible, but unmistakable. We never saw anyone, but it always sounded like a conversation was happening between two people. It would send chills down my spine every single time. There was never anyone on the floor when the elevator doors opened, and we'd check it to see if anyone had come down. There were no signs of anyone walking through the museum. I hated working late at the museum. After hours, when everyone had left and it was just me, it always felt so much worse. The whole building seemed to settle, creaking in strange ways. I'd check everything, turn off the lights, lock the doors. But there were nights I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, moving around. I'd walk through the halls, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, thinking I saw something out of the corner of my eye. But when I'd look, there was nothing there. I kept hearing little noises, like footsteps or the sound of something scraping against the walls. It never made sense. Sometimes I'd turn a corner, expecting to see my husband walking down the hallway, only to find it empty. There was one particular night that really stuck with me. My husband wasn't able to come with me for an event. He'd gotten an offer for a better job, and he was already transitioning out. He had already found a new place to work with health insurance and better pay, so I had to finish up a few things before I could officially leave the museum. It wasn't a big deal, just a small gathering, a local club meeting that rented out the space for a few hours. After the event ended and the guests had gone, I stayed behind to make sure everything was cleaned up. I needed to check upstairs to see if anyone had left any mess behind and to turn off the lights. It was always the same routine. Check the upstairs area, turn off the lights, and lock up before leaving. I headed upstairs and turned off the lights in each room. The upstairs was a narrow, winding space with old wooden floors that creaked underfoot. It wasn't an area that got much use, so it always felt extra lonely up there after hours. I looked around, checking every corner to make sure I didn't miss anything. After making sure everything was in order, I started heading back downstairs. As I walked down the narrow staircase toward the back exit, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, but then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as though someone was walking upstairs. But I had just checked upstairs. There was no one else in the building. I was completely alone. I froze, my heart started to race. I listened closely, and sure enough, there were footsteps moving around above me. I quickly turned to the staircase, feeling that familiar sense of dread creeping up on me. I had no idea what to do. I knew I had just checked every single room up there. I hadn't seen anyone, and there was no one else in the building. I should have gone back up to double check, but my gut told me to leave. I noped out of there so fast, I didn't even bother turning off the lights. I ran down the stairs, grabbed my purse, and bolted for the back exit. When I got outside, I felt a little better. At least I was out of that building. But I kept thinking about those footsteps, the fact that I was the only person in the building and still heard them. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind or the old building making noises. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. And then there was the elevator. Even though I was out of the building, I couldn't stop thinking about the elevator doors opening on their own, the voices we'd sometimes hear coming from inside. It felt like someone, or something, was still in there moving around. I was glad my husband had found a better job. I was honestly relieved. Being pregnant only made everything feel worse. I had no intention of working at the museum alone after that. No way. My husband's new job meant we had a steady income, and there was no reason for me to stick around in that place, dealing with whatever was going on in that building. I made it clear to the museum that I wasn't going to work there anymore. They understood, and I told them they could look for a replacement. But when they asked me to stay on until they found someone else, I told them no. There was no way in hell I was working there alone again. Eventually, the museum hired interns to take over our position, but they didn't last long. It was strange. They'd come in with enthusiasm, ready to handle the work, but after a few weeks, they'd quit. It was like the building got to them too. Maybe they'd experienced something similar to what I had, or maybe it was just the overall creepiness of the place. But no one stuck around. They always found excuses to leave. It was one of those things that no one ever talked about directly, but we all knew it was why they left. Before I left the museum for good, I looked up the history of the building. I wanted to know if something had happened there, something that might explain the strange happenings. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find anything specific. The building had changed hands so many times, different owners, different businesses, and then the museum. I found mention of the theater, the butcher shop, the hardware store, but nothing that stood out as particularly eerie or tragic. There were no deaths or accidents that explained the weird occurrences. But the more I looked, the more I felt like I was just scratching the surface. Looking back, I can't say for sure what was going on in that building. Maybe it was just old. Maybe the strange noises were just the sounds of a building settling, or maybe it was something else altogether. But I've never felt comfortable around that place, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that something was off. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it, but I do know this. I'm glad I'm not there anymore. I have a family now, and I have no intention of working alone in a place like that again. And if I'm being honest, I hope I never have to walk past that building again. I had just finished packing up my car and was about to start the long journey across the country. Moving from the East Coast to the West Coast, the drive was going to be grueling, but it was something I had to do. My car was loaded with boxes, bags, and odds and ends of everything that I didn't want to leave behind. The heat of Arizona was already making itself known, and I could feel the heat radiating off the pavement as I cruised along, heading westward on the endless stretch of highway. I had been driving for hours, and the gas gauge was quickly sinking toward empty. I'd passed a few small towns, but nothing that looked like it could offer any sort of decent stop. Then I saw it, a small, rundown gas station tucked off the highway. It looked like it had been there for decades, with faded signs and a single, flickering light overhead. There weren't any other cars at the pumps, just a lonely spot for me to fill up and grab a drink before continuing my trek. I pulled up to the nearest pump, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. I hadn't planned on stopping for long. Just a quick fuel up, a bottle of water, and back on the road. My car has one of those stickers on the door that says, "Just breathe, you'll never live this moment again." It's a reminder to myself to be present and not get too lost in the past. It's something I've clung to for a long time, especially after a rough breakup and a series of personal losses that left me questioning everything. The gas station was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. I opened my car door and stepped out, the hot desert air hitting me like a wall. I made my way to the pump, grabbed the nozzle, and started filling up. My mind was occupied with thoughts of the road ahead, just the usual stuff. I wasn't really paying attention to the car that had pulled up to the pump opposite me until I heard a voice. "Hey, that sticker," the man said. He had a rough voice, like he'd been smoking for years, and when I glanced over, I saw that he was standing by his truck, filling it up as well. "What's it mean?" I looked at him, trying to place the words. He looked like any other man in his late 30s, early 40s. His hair was scruffy, and he had a stubble-covered face that made him seem a little worn out. He was dressed in a t-shirt and jeans, and his truck looked like it had seen better days. "It means I try to live in the moment," I said, shrugging slightly. "Not be a prisoner to the past, you know?" He nodded, his expression distant, as though he were lost in thought. I figured he was just another guy passing through, making small talk. But then he said something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. "I should have just taken a breath when I caught my wife with my best friend," he said, his voice oddly calm. "Instead, I put a bullet in both of them." I froze. For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him right. I looked up from the pump, trying to gauge whether he was joking or serious. But there was no humor in his eyes, no sign of playfulness. He just stared at me, the same distant look on his face. What?" I stammered. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. Did this guy just confess to killing 2 people? Right there? Out of nowhere. He didn't respond at first, just kept filling up his truck as if nothing was wrong. Then he continued, like it was the most casual thing in the world. "They ruined my life," he said. "My wife and my best friend. They took everything from me. All the plans we had, the family we were going to have. It wasn't worth it. I should have just taken a breath, but I didn't. I didn't know what to say. My brain was racing, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I was alone at a gas station in the middle of nowhere with a guy who had just confessed to murder. The situation was so surreal that it felt like a bad dream. "Yeah, that probably would have been better," I muttered, hoping that my voice didn't betray the fear that was beginning to creep up inside me. He nodded, like he appreciated my sympathy, but it didn't make me feel any better. His eyes were dark, and there was a heaviness about him, like he'd been carrying a burden for far too long. I could hear the sound of the gas pump clicking, signaling that he had finished filling up, but he didn't stop talking. "It's funny," he said, staring off into the distance. "You think you know someone. You think you can trust them. But then you catch them, and everything changes. You can't go back. You just can't go back." My heart was pounding in my chest. I was trying to stay calm, trying to be polite, but everything in me was screaming to get away. I kept my eyes on my pump, praying that it would finish before his. I didn't know where I was, didn't know how far the next gas station was, and I didn't want to seem rude by rushing off. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how dangerous this situation could be. I was alone, a woman in the middle of nowhere, and this man was talking about shooting people like it was nothing. I didn't know if he was lying, or if it was something that had happened years ago, or if he was just waiting for me to say something that would set him off. I didn't know his intentions, but I couldn't risk finding out. The sound of the pump clicking finally broke the tension. His truck was full, and I didn't want to stick around any longer than I had to. I quickly hung up the nozzle and made a move toward my car. "Okay, gotta go," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my voice was shaking. "Nice talking to you. Bye." He didn't say anything else, just stood there, watching me as I walked back to my car. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't dare look back. My hands were shaking as I got in, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't even check to make sure the door was locked. I just pulled out of the parking spot and sped away. As I drove off, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me. But there was nothing, just the lonely road behind me and the dark desert ahead. I didn't call the cops. I didn't know if the guy was telling the truth or not. He could have been lying. He could have been long past the event he was describing, or he could have been a danger right then and there. I didn't know. I just knew that I had to get away. The road stretched on for miles, the emptiness of the desert swallowing me up. I felt a little safer the further I got from that gas station, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much worse. My mind raced, running through all the scenarios of what could have happened. What if I had stayed longer? What if I had been more polite, or tried to talk to him more? The thoughts didn't stop for hours. I didn't stop at another gas station until I was much further down the road. When I finally did pull into another station, I locked my doors and stayed in the car for a while, just breathing, trying to calm down. I thought about calling the police, but I had no real information. No names, no license plate, just a vague description of a man who had said something terrifying. In the end, I chose not to. I figured if he had done what he said, it had probably been years ago. And if he was still dangerous, there wasn't much I could do. But that feeling, that nagging feeling of being so close to something so dark, stayed with me for a long time. I kept driving, watching the sun dip low in the sky as the desert passed me by. I didn't know if I'd ever get a good night's sleep again, but I was thankful for the fact that I had made it out of there in one piece. And I would never look at a gas station the same way again. The next time I saw a car pulling up next to mine, I didn't even make eye contact. The festival happens every year, and every year, I witness something I can't quite explain. It's as though the ground beneath us becomes something more than earth, something more ancient and darker, drawing out the oldest emotions and fears, leaving us all suspended in a web of memory and shadow. Our Roma community lives in a secluded corner of the world, far from the cities, hidden beneath a dense canopy of trees and fields that stretch on endlessly, dotted with wild flowers that intoxicate the air with their scent. The air is thick with it, almost heavy, like it carries something you can't quite place, something that feels both familiar and wrong at the same time. I've been to the festival many times now, watched the elders perform their dances and rituals, seen the sweat on their brows glisten like the dew on the grass before the sun rises. It's a solemn affair, and for us, it's a way to connect with our past, to honor what's been lost and what we continue to fight to preserve. My people, our culture, was decimated during the Holocaust. We lost so much, but we held on to what we could. We've reconstructed what we can from the scattered remnants of oral history passed down through generations. The songs, the dances, the chants, they are our way of remembering. They are our way of keeping the dead close, of ensuring that what happened to us never fades from memory. The elders know all the words, all the movements. They speak in tongues that no one outside our community understands, words that resonate deep in the chest, words that stir the blood. They invoke, they dispel, they command spirits, memories, forces both known and unknown. We, the younger ones, watch and listen in awe, caught between reverence and unease. The ritual is meant to purge, to cleanse us of any malignancy that might have taken root. But sometimes, during the most intense parts of the ceremony, something changes. I've seen it happen before. Someone will be dancing, caught up in the rhythm, their body moving frantically, and then without warning, they'll collapse. At first, it's just exhaustion, but then they'll wake up, their face pale, their eyes wide with terror, as if they've just come from somewhere far away, somewhere they don't want to remember. They never speak of it afterward, but I can see it in their eyes, the terror, the disorientation, the sense of something unnameable pressing on them from all sides. The festival is supposed to be a celebration of life, but there's always this undercurrent of dread that runs through it. I've always wondered what it is that causes the people to act like this, what it is that they feel, what they experience. I've heard the explanations, of course. Some say it's the trauma, the emotional weight that's carried through generations, resurfacing in the midst of the dance and the chanting. Others claim it's the drugs or alcohol, something in the air that affects the mind and body, causing these strange episodes. But when I look into the eyes of those who collapse, when I see the expression of pure, unrelenting terror etched on their faces, I can't help but wonder if there's something more to it. We've always believed that our ancestors are with us in spirit, that they watch over us, guide us, and sometimes, when they need to, they intervene. Some call it magic, others call it superstition. But I've seen enough to know that there is something to it. Something beyond the rational, something that pulls at the edges of your mind and makes you question what you know to be true. As the festival approaches each year, I can feel the tension building in the air. It's as if the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The flowers bloom in abundance, their colors more vivid than usual, their scent stronger, heavier. The trees seem to lean in, their branches swaying in the wind, as though they're listening, waiting. And the people, the dancers, the singers, they become more intense, more fervent as the day goes on, as though something inside them is awakening, stirring, pushing them towards something they cannot control. I've often wondered if the elders are aware of it, if they feel it too, this pull, this stirring of ancient forces. They've never said anything about it, but I can see it in the way they move, the way they speak in those strange foreign tongues. They don't seem afraid, but I can tell that they know something. They know something that we don't. The night before the festival, the atmosphere is always the heaviest. The air is thick with the scent of wildflowers, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the distant murmur of the river that runs through the valley. The sky is clear, but the stars seem dim, as if they are fading, slipping away. We gather around the fire, the elders leading us in the first of many chants, the rhythm of their voices rising and falling like the tide. The fire crackles and spits, casting long shadows across the ground, and I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as if something is watching, waiting. I try to shake off the feeling, but it lingers. As the night wears on, the dancers begin their movements. They move in circles, their feet slapping the ground in time with the drumming. The chant grows louder, more insistent, the words growing harder to understand. It's all part of the ritual, part of the release, part of the cleansing. But tonight, something feels different. The energy in the air is more charged, more electric, and I can see it in the faces of the dancers. Their expressions are twisted with something I can't place. They seem entranced, lost in the rhythm, their bodies moving with a frantic energy that borders on the unnatural. One dancer, a girl I've seen at the festival before, falls to the ground with a scream. At first, I think it's part of the act, part of the performance, but then I see her eyes, wide unseeing, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Her body jerks and convulses as though something is trying to force its way out of her. I've seen this happen before, but this time, it's different. This time, the terror in her eyes is palpable, real. She isn't acting. She's not pretending. When they pull her away from the circle, she's shaking uncontrollably, her face pale, her body covered in sweat. Her breathing is shallow, erratic, and she doesn't speak. She just stares wide-eyed at the fire, as though she's seen something in its flames that no one else has. I watch as the elders surround her, muttering in their strange language, their hands hovering over her body, their voices rising in pitch. For a moment, I feel like I'm on the edge of something dangerous, something ancient, and I can't shake the feeling that this isn't just a ritual. This isn't just a dance. I don't know how long I stand there, watching, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my spine. When the girl finally opens her eyes, she looks at me for a moment, and I swear she doesn't recognize me. Her eyes are vacant, distant, as though she's somewhere else, somewhere far away. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it's over. She's silent, her body still, as though nothing happened. The elders speak to her in low, calming tones, but I can see the unease in their eyes. They know too. They know something that none of us fully understand. The festival continues into the night, but for me the magic, the power, has shifted. It's no longer something to be celebrated. It's no longer a way to remember the dead. It's something darker, something that reaches into the deepest parts of us, pulling out things we can't explain, things we don't want to face. When the festival ends, when the fire dies down and the dancers finally fall still, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. The girl never speaks of what happened to her, but I can see it in her eyes. The same emptiness, the same terror. It's as if she's been touched by something that she can't explain, something that none of us can understand. The fields are quiet now, the flowers having wilted, the air still. But I know that something lingers here, something that we've all felt, something that will never leave. The elders know it, too, and they continue their work, weaving their incantations, speaking their ancient words. But I wonder, what are they really calling? What are they really protecting us from? I don't know, but I'm not sure I want to find out. I don't know why I took that back road that night. I'd driven down it 1,000 times before, no issues. It was a shortcut that shaved off a few minutes from my route and made it easier to deliver pizzas, especially late at night when traffic was almost non-existent. That was the thing about my job. Lots of late-night deliveries, and sometimes I'd find myself out in places where no one else seemed to be. I didn't mind. The quiet, the isolation, it felt peaceful, like my own little world. Or so I thought. I'd been working as a pizza delivery guy for a few years, and by that point, I had learned the ins and outs of the area. The main roads, the shortcuts, the weird little twists and turns that seemed unimportant during the day, but felt strangely significant at night when the roads were empty and the headlights of my car were the only thing illuminating the way. It was a Wednesday, late enough that most people were already tucked into bed. I'd picked up the pizza from the store and headed toward the customer's house. I knew the address. It was on a stretch of road just outside town, and taking the back road was the quickest way to get there. It's a road I'd used 100 times, one I trusted. It was dark, but it was just a straight shot, with hardly any turns. I could practically do it in my sleep. I turned onto the back road without a second thought. The headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the trees on either side. The air outside was chilly, and I had the window cracked just a little for the fresh air. I didn't feel nervous. Why would I? I'd been down this road so many times. But that night, something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was just the late hour, but I couldn't shake the weird sense that something wasn't right. I didn't notice the high beams at first. It was just a faint flash in the rearview mirror, but then they grew brighter. I assumed someone had just gotten behind me without me noticing. The thing was, they were too close. Really close. I mean, it wasn't like the usual cars that followed behind for a bit and then passed when they could. No, this one stayed right behind me, too close for comfort. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel a little tighter, trying to push down the creeping unease. The lights stayed right behind me. It was an empty road, the kind where there was nowhere to pull over, and yet the car didn't pass. I kept waiting for them to. The road was straight, no curves or turns, just a long stretch ahead of me. It wasn't like there was anywhere for them to go but around me. But they didn't. The longer I drove, the more annoyed I got. What kind of idiot tailgate that closely? I wasn't speeding, wasn't doing anything wrong, but there they were, so close I could practically feel their headlights shining through my rearview mirror. I didn't want to look behind me, but I couldn't help it. The high beams were blinding, and the fact that they stayed so close made my skin crawl. Whoever it was, they weren't acting like a normal driver. I drove for a few miles, still no sign of any turns or roads that could have let them pass. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, almost like a light flicking off, the high beams were gone. I looked in my rearview mirror. Nothing. No car. No lights. The road behind me was empty. It made no sense. I was sure there hadn't been any side roads. I would have noticed. But there was nothing. I almost missed my turn for the delivery. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what had happened, and I barely caught the small sign for the turnoff just in time. I didn't want to think about it. I had a job to do. I parked, dropped off the pizza, and left without looking around too much. The last thing I wanted was to think about what had just happened. But as I pulled out, I felt that sense of unease creeping back. Something wasn't right. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if there was something genuinely wrong, but I couldn't shake it. I got back on the main road, thinking that maybe I was just imagining things. But as I rounded the curve and headed back toward town, I saw it again. The high beams, right behind me. At first, I thought it was a car coming up behind me, but as it got closer, I realized it was the same one. The same set of high beams. It was like they were right on top of me, too close again. I glanced at the rearview mirror, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't see the car, just the blinding lights. But they were right there, as if they were trying to push me off the road. This time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I had a clear stretch of road ahead of me, so I sped up a little, hoping the car would just pass. But they didn't. They stayed right behind me, matching my speed. The road was still empty, just me and this car. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, like a weight pressing down on me. My eyes kept darting between the road and the rearview mirror. I turned off the high beams, hoping it would make a difference, but the car didn't back off. The lights stayed right there, as if they were glued to me. It was the same situation as before, no other roads, no place for them to turn off. Just this straight road, and me with that car tailing me. At this point, I was starting to feel a panic rising in my chest. What was going on? Who was this person? Why wouldn't they pass me? Were they trying to scare me? I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my heart racing. And just like last time, the high beams flicked off. Gone. Just like that. I didn't know what to think. I felt like I was losing my mind. I hadn't passed any side roads. I hadn't seen any other cars. But there it was. The same thing happening twice. I didn't stop to think about it much longer. I wanted to get back to town and put some distance between myself and whatever the hell that was. I made it back to the main road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I took a few turns, trying to shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But I wasn't stupid. Something wasn't right. A couple of weeks passed, and I had almost forgotten about the whole thing. The back road still felt like the quickest way to get to some of my deliveries, and the memory of that strange tailgating car faded with time. But then late one night, I had to take it again. I didn't want to, but the delivery was a little farther out, and I was already running late. I thought maybe the second time would be different. Maybe I'd just imagined everything before. I was wrong. The same thing happened. The high beams appeared behind me, too close, right on my bumper. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone was watching me, that they were waiting for something. The road ahead was empty, like always, but the lights stayed behind me. I didn't want to glance in the rearview mirror, but I did. The high beams were blinding. The car was too close. I couldn't see the person driving, just the lights. I tried speeding up. I tried slowing down, but the car stayed with me. I finally had enough. I pulled off the road onto a small turnout and parked. I sat there for a minute waiting. The car never passed. No lights, no movement. I waited a few more minutes before slowly pulling back out onto the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I made it the rest of the way to the delivery without incident, but the whole time I was looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those headlights again. When I finished the delivery and got back in the car, I didn't hesitate. I didn't even take the back road again. I went around the long way. I don't know who that person was, or why they followed me. Maybe it was just some prank, maybe it was something worse. But after that night, I never took that back road again. The memory of those high beams, always too close, always too persistent, stayed with me. I didn't feel safe on that road anymore, and I don't think I ever will. It was late, far later than I'd ever normally stay at a bar. The night had come to an end, the last of the drunks had staggered out, and the place had finally quieted down. The usual thrum of music and chatter had faded into an eerie silence, one that only seems to creep in when you're alone in an old building. The kind of silence that almost feels unnatural. I had been covering a shift as security that night, something I did occasionally when one of the regular guys needed time off. The bar itself was situated in a building that had seen a lot of history. The place was old, probably built around the early 1900s, and had been serving drinks since shortly after Prohibition ended. You could tell by the way the floorboards creaked underfoot, how the walls had settled and shifted over the years, and how the air smelled like decades of tobacco, spilled liquor, and sweat had soaked into the wooden beams. I'd already helped the manager, Mike, clear out the bar after everyone had left. The place was pretty well empty now except for the two of us, and we were in the process of locking up. Mike, a guy in his mid-30s, looked tired, his face showing the strain of a long night. I didn't mind though. It was kind of nice having someone to talk to while I worked the late shift, even if the conversations were usually small talk about nothing important. As we started heading towards the back of the bar, Mike asked me if I wanted to help him offload some liquor into the basement. I had no plans, and it would probably save him some time, so I agreed. The basement was a bit of a hassle to get to. It was tucked away in the back of the building, and it was always a bit too dark down there. No matter how many light bulbs they installed, it never seemed to be fully lit, and there was this constant damp, musty smell that made the place feel off. It wasn't a place you ever wanted to linger, especially if you weren't familiar with it. We headed down the narrow stairs, the old wood creaking beneath us, as we made our way to the basement. There were shelves lining the walls, and crates of bottles stacked in every corner. Mike started placing the various liquor bottles on the shelves, mumbling under his breath about stock levels or something. I didn't really pay much attention. Most of it was the usual work banter. But then something strange happened. As I was placing a bottle of whiskey onto one of the shelves, I felt it. A prickling sensation crawling across the back of my neck, like someone was standing right behind me. It wasn't a breeze. It wasn't anything logical. It was just this unsettling feeling that hit me out of nowhere. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain, just a deep, nagging sense of being watched. I froze for a moment, scanning the basement. The shelves were stacked with liquor crates, some empty, some full, but everything else seemed still, almost too still. I glanced over at Mike, hoping it was just me being jumpy from the silence, but when I looked at him, I saw him laughing. "You feel like you're being watched right now, don't you?" he asked, his voice low, like he was sharing a secret. "Don't worry about it too much. It happens all the time." I didn't really know how to respond to that. I had been here plenty of times before, but I had never felt that way, like eyes were on me in a place I had worked in so many times. But Mike's easygoing demeanor and the way he shrugged it off made me think it was probably nothing. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to putting the liquor on the shelves. That's when the sound came, the hissing. It was loud, almost deafening, and it came from the far side of the basement, where we kept all of the kegs and CO2 taps. Those taps, used to serve beer, make a pretty distinct hissing noise when they're activated. I didn't need to be told what it was, and for a second, I thought maybe someone had been sneaking around in the bar after we locked up. I rushed upstairs without even thinking, half expecting to catch someone red-handed. The sound of the hissing grew louder as I made my way up, and my heart was already racing by the time I reached the main floor. I rushed straight for the front door, half expecting it to be wide open with someone standing there, taking advantage of the empty bar. But when I threw open the door, it was dead quiet. The door was still locked, the lights were still off, and there was no sign of anyone around. No one in sight. It felt strange. I shrugged to myself, chalking it up to a random noise. Maybe a pipe had shifted or something had just settled, but something inside me still felt off. I walked back into the bar area, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. My eyes went instinctively to the bar, where I had just finished cleaning and stacking the stools. That's when I saw them. Shot glasses. There, on the bar top. 2 shot glasses, sitting side by side, as if they had just been used. But there was no way that was possible. I had cleaned the bar off myself, stacked the stools, and checked everything before heading downstairs. There had been nothing on the bar. No shot glasses. No mess. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the glasses, trying to make sense of it. I walked over to them slowly, half expecting them to disappear or vanish, like a trick of the light. But they were real, too real. I felt my stomach tighten, and the hairs on my arms stood up. Something wasn't right. It was as if the bar itself was holding a secret, like it was trying to tell me something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever I had felt earlier in the basement wasn't my imagination. It was something more, something I couldn't explain. I didn't know what it was, but it was there. I took one last look around the bar, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The place seemed too quiet now, too still, like the whole building was holding its breath. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone into my pocket, and walked out the door. I didn't bother to lock up. I just needed to leave. I wasn't going to spend another second in that place. I walked back to my usual bar, the one I always worked at, and the familiar noise and bustle of people made the silence of the other bar feel even more oppressive. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it stayed with me, the image of those shot glasses on the bar top burning into my mind. What had happened? Why did it feel so strange? Why had I been so freaked out? I never went back to that bar again. It wasn't because I was afraid. It was just that I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened there. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to be around anymore. Maybe Mike was right. Maybe that feeling of being watched was normal for that place. Maybe the building had its own quirks. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to find out. Whatever it was better left alone. And sometimes, it's better not to ask too many questions. I'd had my fill of that bar. I just hoped the next guy who worked the late shift wasn't going to feel the same way I did. We've always driven a lot. My wife and I, that is. It's one of those things that just became part of our routine, you know? A lot of people might think we were crazy for spending so much time on the road, but for us, it was normal. The kind of driving we did wasn't for vacations or long trips to faraway places. It was the kind of driving where you're just going in circles around your home area, just killing time. We'd get in the car, drive through the streets, maybe grab a coffee, go out for dinner, or just talk about our day, whatever. I don't know why we did it, but it became this thing we looked forward to. Every evening, after work, after dinner, when the day would start winding down, we'd get in the car, roll down the windows, and hit the road. We'd drive to places we didn't need to go. There was no real destination, just the feeling of movement, the comfort of being with each other, and the quiet of the evening. I guess that's why, over the years, we've seen a lot of strange things on the road. You know, nothing that you could prove was paranormal, but definitely things that didn't sit right with us. People following us, weird figures standing in fields at night, things that made you wonder what was going on. But there was one night, well, one morning really, that stood out more than all the others. It wasn't anything spectacular or dramatic. It wasn't a chase or a scary figure lurking in the shadows. It wasn't even something I'd call paranormal. But it stuck with me. Every time I drive by that spot, I think about it. It was early in the morning, just before the sun was starting to rise. I had just gotten off the night shift, and my wife was with me, just like always. It had become a habit of ours for her to come with me on the way to work in the mornings. She didn't have to be up this early, but she'd come along for the ride. Maybe it was because we both liked the quietness of the world at that hour, when most people were still asleep and the streets felt almost empty. We were driving down the main road out of town, the one that cuts through a residential area and eventually turns into farmland. This road is one of those familiar routes that you end up driving on so many times that it doesn't even register anymore. You just know it like the back of your hand. I guess that's how it became a ritual for us, familiar, comforting, like a piece of home. The air smelled like early morning dew, fresh but with that faint earthy scent of a new day beginning. There's a sharp curve in the road at the edge of town, just before you get to the outskirts. A lot of people would slow down when they came around it, but I was used to it. I knew that bend like the back of my hand. I didn't have to slow down. As we neared the bend, I could already see the familiar sight of the produce stand, lit up by a single flickering streetlight. The stand is always quiet at this time of day. It doesn't open for hours, not until around 9 a.m. The stand sits in a large parking lot, and there's a cashier's tent set up nearby, all covered with plastic tarps. It's the kind of place that's always empty in the early hours. Most people would see the place and just keep driving, not giving it much thought. But on this particular morning, as we were getting closer, something caught my eye. Just before the sharp bend, you can see the whole parking lot and the produce stand. The road is a little higher than the lot itself, so when you drive by, your headlights shine across the area like a spotlight. It's the kind of place that feels like it's almost always abandoned in the mornings, especially when it's dark outside. The first thing that caught my attention was a figure crouched down near the stack of wooden boxes that usually held fruit or vegetables. It was strange. I had never seen anyone there at that hour, and there was no reason anyone would be there. At first, I thought it might be some kind of animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but then I realized it was a person. I couldn't make out much of their details, but I could see they were hunched over, almost like they were looking through the boxes. The figure didn't move at all as we passed by. Not until we were almost past them. Then, just as I was about to look away, they lifted their head. They didn't make any sudden movements or try to run, but they looked directly at us. Just for a moment, they stared, like they didn't expect anyone to see them. But then they went right back to whatever they were doing. It wasn't the kind of thing that screamed danger, but there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't like someone waiting for the store to open, or someone picking up something they dropped. It felt off. The whole scene was just odd, and my stomach tightened as we drove by. I glanced at my wife, but she hadn't said anything. She had seen it too. I could tell by the way her body stiffened for a second, but she didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. We both knew something wasn't right, but we didn't talk about it. The drive continued in silence, and we didn't say a word about the figure. But as I drove through the next few blocks, my mind kept drifting back to it. Why was someone crouched down there, in the dark, at a produce stand that didn't open for hours? It didn't make sense. There weren't any cars around, no one else that I could see. It was just that one person, hunched over and looking through boxes, in a place where no one should have been. I thought maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe it was just a homeless person, someone in need of food or shelter. But something about it still felt weird. The fact that they were out there in the early hours of the morning, by themselves, doing something that seemed so odd, left me with a sense of unease. It wasn't like they were out there for anything specific. It didn't seem like they were trying to steal anything. There was no cash or anything to take. The whole thing just didn't sit right with me. When we reached the edge of town, I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd seen people wander in strange places before, sure, but this was different. I kept glancing back at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure still standing there, just staring. But the road was empty, and the streetlights were starting to flicker off one by one, signaling the early morning hours. The air had a chill to it, like the world was just beginning to wake up. It almost felt like I had imagined it, that the whole thing had been some weird trick of the light or a figment of my tired mind. I tried to push it out of my head, but it stuck with me. It wasn't the kind of thing that you could explain away easily. The fact that the produce stand didn't open until later in the morning, the fact that the person was crouched down so low to the ground, none of it made sense. And it was that lack of explanation that kept it in my thoughts long after we passed by. We didn't talk about it when we got to work. The morning went on as usual, but that incident kept popping into my mind. Every time I drove past that bend in the road, I would glance over at the produce stand, half expecting to see the same figure, crouched down and searching through boxes in the dark. But the stand was always empty, just like it should have been. A few days later, I brought it up to my wife, but I could tell she had been thinking about it too. We didn't need to say much. Just a simple, "That was weird, wasn't it?" was all it took. We both agreed that it had been unsettling, but neither of us had a good reason why. Maybe it was just a person in a bad spot, or maybe it was something else. We didn't know. After a while, life went on, and the whole thing faded into the background. But every once in a while, when we drove by that same spot, I couldn't help but glance over at the produce stand. Every time, it looked the same, empty and quiet, with nothing unusual to see. And even though nothing ever happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that morning, whatever it was, wasn't meant to be there. I had been working at the assisted living facility for about a year by the time this happened. It was one of those jobs that started off feeling a little uncomfortable, but eventually became second nature. I was a dietary aide, which meant I helped the kitchen staff with everything from serving meals to making sure everyone got their meds at the right time. But the real reason I stayed on was because of the residents. Some people think it's strange, but I felt an odd connection to the elderly. They'd tell me stories, share pieces of their lives that I never thought I'd hear, and they became more like family than just people I helped serve lunch to. The schedule was easy to get used to. I worked Sundays from noon to 7 p.m., which meant I was there for the afternoon meal and dinner. The cook usually took a break in the afternoon, leaving me alone in the kitchen for a while. It wasn't a big deal. I had gotten used to it over time. My job was mostly to clean the dishes, set up for dinner, and make sure things were running smoothly. After lunch, the coffee on the bar would always be cold, and that's when one of the residents, Mrs. Woodson, would appear. She had a bit of a routine. She'd walk up to the kitchen door and knock gently, always reminding me that the coffee needed to be freshened up. I'd nod and go make a new pot for her. Mrs. Woodson had been at the facility for a few years by the time I started working there. She was one of the sweetest residents, but she was also incredibly sharp for her age. I never saw her without her cardigan, and she always had this quiet, dignified way about her. I knew exactly what she liked and how she liked it. Fresh coffee, a little sugar, no cream, and a toast with jam on the side. I was used to her routine, so when she came to the kitchen door to tell me about the coffee, it wasn't strange. It was just what happened every Sunday afternoon. But that day, things felt different. It started like any other Sunday. I was in the kitchen after lunch, tidying up and getting ready for dinner. I washed dishes, wiped down counters, and went about my usual business. The cook had gone on his break, so I was left alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of silverware. But as I worked, I noticed something strange. Pots and pans that had been hanging on hooks suddenly swung, banging together in a way that I couldn't explain. Drawers slammed open and closed, almost like someone was playing a prank, but I was completely alone in the kitchen. At first, I brushed it off. The place had always had a certain atmosphere about it. People talked about the building being haunted, but I didn't believe in that stuff. It was just old, creaky, and sometimes a little eerie. I figured it was just one of those days when the old place seemed a bit more active. I shook my head and continued working, trying to ignore the sounds around me. As I moved around, I heard a soft tap on the door that led into the dining room. I glanced over to the small window, expecting to see Mrs. Woodson standing there with her usual polite request for fresh coffee. Sure enough, she was there, her slight figure framed in the doorway. I smiled, nodded, and set about making a new pot of coffee. It was something I had done countless times before, and I was used to the rhythm of it. I brewed the coffee, pouring it into the carafe, and brought it out to the bar, setting it down in front of her usual spot. I didn't think much of it, other than the usual familiarity of the task. But that night, during dinner, I noticed something strange. Mrs. Woodson wasn't at her usual seat. I figured maybe her family had come to pick her up early, though that wasn't usual for a Sunday. They typically took her out for lunch, but she was almost always back in time for dinner. Still, I didn't think too much of it. Maybe she had just gone out with them for the day. The night wore on. I kept myself busy with cleaning and preparing the dining room for the next day. By the time my shift was winding down and I was clocking out, one of the residents, Mr. Thompson, stopped me in the hall. He was a regular around the facility, and we often chatted as I finished my shifts. "Hey, have you heard the news?" he asked, his voice a little more subdued than usual. I shook my head, not sure what he was talking about. "Mrs. Woodson passed away this morning," he said quietly. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. I wasn't sure what to say. Mrs. Woodson had been getting older, sure, but she was always so sharp, always so present. I hadn't noticed anything that would have suggested she was close to passing away. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. How could she have passed away that morning? I had just seen her in the kitchen, not even a few hours ago. I didn't know how to respond. Mr. Thompson seemed to read the confusion on my face. He continued, "She died right after breakfast. I guess her family came to say goodbye, and they didn't know she had passed until later. I know it's a shock." I stood there, feeling like the world had tilted slightly off its axis. I had just seen her. Just a few hours ago, she was standing there, knocking on the kitchen door and asking me to make fresh coffee. I didn't know what to think. It was surreal. The next day, as I processed the news, I couldn't help but replay everything in my mind. The pots and pans flying around in the kitchen, the way the drawers had slammed shut on their own, the feeling of being watched in that quiet, empty space, and Mrs. Woodson coming to the door to remind me about the coffee. It all kept running through my head in a loop. It wasn't until a week later, when I was working another Sunday shift, that it really hit me. I was walking down the hallway to the dining room when I passed a group of residents gathered in the common area. Mrs. Woodson's chair, the one she always sat in, was empty, and the sight of it made me pause for a moment. I couldn't help but glance at it, thinking about the days when she'd sit there, telling me about her life, giving me advice that felt so simple but so wise. One of the other aides, a woman named Claire, noticed me looking at the empty chair. She must have seen the look on my face because she smiled softly and patted me on the shoulder. "She was a good lady," Claire said, her voice warm. "I know you two were close." I nodded, the words catching in my throat. I had no idea how to explain what I had experienced. How could I tell her that I had seen Mrs. Woodson only hours after she had passed away? It sounded crazy. It didn't make sense. But I knew deep down that she had come back for a reason. She had reminded me about the coffee. I had always thought she was just being kind, looking out for me. But now, I wondered if there was more to it. I finished my shift that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved. Mrs. Woodson had been more than just a resident to me. She had become a part of my routine, a part of my Sunday afternoons. I had always looked forward to seeing her, even though it was just a small interaction. And now, with her gone, there was an emptiness in that spot in the kitchen, a silence where there used to be warmth and familiarity. I never got an answer to why it happened the way it did. I never spoke to anyone about what I experienced that day. It felt too strange, too surreal to even bring up. But part of me, the part that had worked in that kitchen every Sunday, knew that Mrs. Woodson had come back, not in some ghostly form or supernatural sense, but in the way that people who care about you do. She had made sure I was okay. She had made sure I remembered the coffee. I think sometimes about that Sunday afternoon and the strange quiet that followed her death. I think about the way the pots had moved and the drawers had slammed shut. I think about the tap on the door and how I saw her, just as she always was, as though nothing had changed. And in some way, I think she was reminding me that even in the simplest moments, we leave traces behind. Not as ghosts or memories, but as reminders that we were loved, that we mattered. And sometimes, even in death, we find ways to take care of the ones who remain. I was 19 when I moved to Tanzania. I'd grown up in Canada, always surrounded by cold winters, busy streets, and a kind of structure that made everything feel safe, even boring at times. I had this urge to see more of the world, to live somewhere completely different, somewhere where the days felt warmer and the air smelled like something I couldn't name. I signed up for a program through a friend of a friend and ended up living in a medium-sized city about 3 hours from Dar es Salaam. I was staying with a host family in a concrete house with rust-colored dust caked along the sides of the walls and a metal gate out front that screeched when you opened it. The roads were a mix of packed dirt and loose gravel, and it didn't take long for me to understand that sidewalks were optional and that electricity might cut out a few times a week. But none of it really bothered me. The sounds of the city, roosters, loud motorbikes, radios playing in Swahili, kids yelling at each other in the streets, they became normal. I kind of liked the chaos. Within a few weeks, I met a guy named Elias. He was around my age, played soccer for one of the city's inner-city teams, and had this calm but confident energy about him. Everyone knew him, it seemed, and when I walked around with him, people smiled or nodded, or just yelled his name from across the street. We became close friends fast, and I felt like I had someone who could show me the ropes in a place where I didn't look or sound like I belonged. I was one of the very few white people in the area, and definitely the only young white woman I saw in the city most days. I stood out, no matter how hard I tried not to. It was during playoffs when he invited me to one of his games. I didn't fully understand the structure of the leagues, but I knew it mattered. There was this pressure in the air, like everyone was holding their breath all week waiting for the match. The team had been working toward this for months, and if they won, they'd move on to something bigger. Maybe national attention, maybe scouts, maybe money. I don't know all the details. I just knew that Elias was nervous, and if he was nervous, I should probably pay attention. The game was on a Saturday afternoon. The field wasn't like anything I was used to. There were no bleachers, no stadium lights, no fencing. Just a wide stretch of worn-down grass, patches of dirt, and a low cement barrier around it. People stood shoulder to shoulder all around, some climbing on nearby walls, others sitting on the backs of trucks. Some brought drums or makeshift instruments. The crowd was massive and loud, and they weren't just watching the game, they were living inside it. I kept close to the sidelines. There were no designated seats or real security, just a few people in mismatched vests trying to keep things from spilling over. I stayed near a group of women and kids and tried not to be too obvious, but I was getting looks. Curious ones, mostly. A few polite smiles. I was used to it by then. The game itself was intense. Both teams played like something was at stake, and I guess there was. Every pass, every shot on goal, the crowd surged and shouted like waves crashing on a shore. Elias played like he had fire in his chest. Fast, aggressive, smart. They were winning, I thought. At least until something shifted. Late in the second half, one of the players on Elias's team scored. I saw the ball go in with my own eyes. The crowd erupted, people jumped, waved shirts in the air, kids screamed with joy. But then the referee blew his whistle and pointed to the sideline. Offside. Goal denied. At first, it was just confusion. People were shouting at each other, trying to understand what happened. Then I saw anger spread like a fire. I didn't know enough about soccer rules to argue the call, but the reaction around me made it clear. No one believed it was real. The energy changed instantly. It wasn't just disappointment. It was fury. Screaming, stomping, some people throwing things. Elias's team lost after that. The final whistle blew, and just like that, the playoffs were over for them. I stood frozen for a second as the players walked off the field, heads low, some yelling at the ref, others too shocked to speak. I wanted to go find Elias, but the moment I stepped toward the center, a wall of people moved ahead of me. A huge crowd, dozens and dozens, swarmed the middle of the field where the referee was trying to walk away. At first, I thought they were just trying to talk to him, to yell maybe, like crowds do when they're pissed. But then I saw how tight they were circling him. He couldn't move. I pushed forward, still trying to find Elias, but then someone grabbed my arm hard. I turned, startled, and saw a guy I vaguely recognized from previous games, one of Elias's teammates. He didn't say anything, just pulled me sharply toward the edge of the field. I stumbled a bit but followed, ducking under arms and squeezing past people. He led me down a side path and into the mess of motorcycles and cars parked nearby. Elias was there, pacing near a battered van, sweating heavily, not from the game but from something else. He saw me, nodded once, and started moving. I followed him without asking where we were going. The teammate who pulled me out vanished into the crowd. We didn't speak. We just walked, then jogged, then walked again, putting as much distance between us and the field as we could. We took side roads, then cut through a narrow alley between buildings where laundry hung above us like flags. I didn't ask questions. I could feel it in his body language. This wasn't just about losing a game. Something bad was happening, and we needed to leave. By the time we got back to my place, the sun was low and the air was thick. I locked the gate behind us and sat inside for a long time without turning on any lights. The power was out anyway. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel anything really. I just waited. Later that night, when the power flickered back on and the heat finally dropped, Elias sat on the edge of the couch and told me the crowd had turned violent. Really violent. He said they'd surrounded the ref, started pushing him, then hitting him. Rocks were thrown. Someone hit him with a stick. Then others joined. It got out of control fast. There were rumors going around already that the referee didn't survive. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the thin mattress, fully clothed, listening to dogs barking outside and the occasional voice passing by on the road. It was too quiet between the sounds, like the city itself was holding its breath. The next morning, I walked to the corner kiosk to buy bread and eggs like I usually did, hoping to see that things had gone back to normal. But everyone was talking. I didn't understand most of the Swahili, but I caught enough words. Referee dead beaten, Elias's name. People pointed subtly as I passed, not in a threatening way, but like they knew me, knew where I lived, knew I was with him. Back at the house, Elias was pacing again. He said there were stories going around that he'd led the beating, that he was the one who'd started it. Whether it was true or not didn't seem to matter. People believed it. He hadn't even been near the center when the crowd went in, but someone claimed to have seen him throw the first punch. That whole day we kept the doors locked. I stayed inside, drinking lukewarm water, avoiding windows. Every sound outside made me jump. A motorcycle backfiring, kids running past, someone yelling down the street. I couldn't stop thinking that a crowd might form again, that someone might point to our gate and say, "They're in there." I was the white girl in a neighborhood that didn't have many, and I had been seen with Elias too often. People knew I lived there. I knew they did. We made plans to leave the city if things got worse. Elias talked about getting to Dar es Salaam, maybe staying with a cousin for a while. I didn't have a real plan. I didn't want to call anyone from home. What would I say? That I'd gone to a soccer game, and now I was hiding from a potential mob? It sounded ridiculous out loud, but it didn't feel ridiculous in my chest. But nothing happened. Not that day. Not the next. The tension stayed for a while, this thick, invisible fog that settled over the house and the street, but it didn't boil over again. The police opened an investigation, but from what I heard, it was more for show. The referee had died. That part was real, and people had seen who was involved, but no one was being arrested. Not yet. Elias kept his head down. He stopped playing. He didn't go to practices or meetings. He barely left the house for a week. Eventually, the story faded, at least out of the mouths of people in the streets. New things came up, new drama, new stories to pass around. I stayed in the city for a few more months after that, but I moved quieter, more cautiously. I walked less, kept to main roads, didn't go to games again. I still saw Elias, but not as often, and never in public. I never brought up that day again. I think we both preferred it that way. When it was finally time for me to leave, to go back home to Canada, I felt this strange mix of relief and guilt, like I was getting out of something that he still had to live with. I boarded a dusty old bus, said quiet goodbyes, and watched the roads unroll in front of me through the window. It was raining lightly. The air smelled like dirt and fuel, and something sweet I couldn't name. I still think about it sometimes, how fast things can turn, how a single whistle in a soccer game can change the course of someone's life. I don't know what really happened in the center of that field. I wasn't there for it. But I know what fear feels like when it wraps around your spine and sits in your chest like a stone. I know what it's like to be somewhere you don't belong, to stick out, to worry that your face will be the one someone remembers when they're looking for someone to blame. But I also remember walking through that city on cooler mornings, the smell of fried dough from the vendors, the slow rise of the sun over the rooftops. I remember laughter and music and people who had no reason to help me, but did anyway. That's the thing about being somewhere far from home. You don't just remember the danger. You remember all of it, the warmth, I had been traveling alone for a few days, hopping between towns, staying in modest guest houses, and spending most of my time trying to soak in the atmosphere of places I might never visit again. It was one of those quiet evenings where I had nothing much planned. I was sitting on the edge of the bed in my small rented room, flipping through some photos I had taken on the trip, when the thought suddenly struck me. What if I went to see the beach? I had passed by a signboard mentioning it earlier in the day. I remembered it wasn't exactly close to where I was staying, but the idea stuck in my mind. The sun was already beginning to dip in the sky. I looked at the time, calculated how long it might take to get there, and weighed the options. I knew I had to leave early the next morning, and there was a good chance I'd miss seeing the sea altogether if I didn't make the move now. There was a kind of restlessness that wouldn't let me stay still after that. I got up without much of a plan and quickly gathered my things, stuffing my phone, wallet, some change, and my portable charger into a sling bag. I stepped out and locked the door behind me, telling myself that even if I didn't catch the sunset, at least I'd be able to feel the sea breeze and hear the waves before the day ended. The beach wasn't walking distance. I checked the route on my phone and found I'd have to take 2 different buses to get there. It wasn't the most convenient, but it was the most economical, and since I was traveling solo on a limited budget, I decided to stick to public transport. I walked briskly to the nearest bus stand, which was about half a kilometer away, and waited under the orange streetlight. The air was warm and still, with the occasional hum of a scooter or car passing by. The first bus arrived on time, and I hopped in, sitting by the window and watching the narrow streets and small shops go by. It was a bit crowded, but the kind of crowd that's used to each other's presence, quiet, unbothered. I kept checking my phone now, and then to make sure I was on the right track. By the time I reached the stop where I needed to switch to the second bus, the sun had already set behind the buildings. The sky was glowing faintly with the last bit of daylight, painted in purple and gray. Still, I told myself I could at least walk on the sand for a few minutes, maybe listen to the waves in the dark before heading back. It wasn't ideal, but something felt unfinished about my trip if I didn't go. The second bus was delayed. It felt like forever, and I began wondering if I should just skip it and head back. But then it finally came, and I got in. The passengers looked more local, older women with plastic bags full of groceries, a group of college students chatting loudly in the back, and a few tired-looking men staring out the window in silence. I found an empty seat somewhere near the middle and sat down. The woman beside me was on her phone, chatting and laughing with her friends who were sitting a few seats away. I turned to her politely and asked if she could tell me when my stop came up. She nodded quickly without really listening and returned to her conversation. I had hoped she'd keep an eye out for me, but soon she seemed completely absorbed in whatever they were discussing. It was getting darker outside with every passing minute. The bus wasn't stopping frequently anymore, and I started to grow anxious. I turned on my phone's GPS and tried to track my location. The signal was patchy, but I managed to keep a rough eye on where I was. As we got closer to the beach area, I looked out the window, trying to catch a glimpse of the sea or any landmark that would indicate we were close. But what I saw made my chest tighten. Everything outside was pitch black. The street lights that had lined the roads earlier were gone. The bus had taken a turn off the main road, and now we were moving fast through a narrow, winding stretch with dense trees on either side. I couldn't see a single shop, house, or human being. My heartbeat quickened. I hadn't expected it to be this isolated. I glanced at my phone again, and it showed we were moving in the opposite direction from the beach. My stomach dropped. Before I could process what was happening, the bus had already passed the area where I should have gotten off. I stood up quickly, trying to look out again, but it was just black shapes and shadows rushing by in the dark. I told myself to calm down and just wait until the next stop. I thought I'd get down there and figure out how to get back, but I was already starting to feel uneasy. There was something about the complete absence of light and the speed of the bus that made it hard to breathe normally. I didn't want to ask for help. I don't know why. Maybe it was pride or just the general discomfort of traveling alone in a strange place. But I sat back down, gripping my bag tightly and waiting. Eventually, the bus began to slow down. It came to a halt at a tiny stop, just a concrete block by the side of the road with no shelter, no signboard, nothing. I looked around as I stepped off the bus, and the feeling that hit me then is something I'll never forget. I stood there frozen. It was the darkest place I had ever been. No lights from houses. No lights from passing vehicles. Not even the sky offered much comfort. It was overcast and moonless. The bus pulled away and disappeared around a bend, and I was left standing completely alone. The silence was crushing. I looked around and saw trees, tall, thick, and swaying gently in the night breeze. I realized I was somewhere on the edge of the Western Ghats, where the forest starts creeping into the villages. I had read about how wild and dense these areas could be, but reading and experiencing are two completely different things. I tried not to panic. I told myself to just stay calm and find a safe place to wait until I figured out a way back. That's when I saw 2 girls get off the same bus. I felt a small surge of relief. At least I wasn't completely alone. But before I could even open my mouth or walk towards them, they started walking fast toward a narrow path that led straight into the trees. I stood there watching them vanish, swallowed by the darkness, their footsteps crunching the leaves for just a second before everything went silent again. They had to be locals, I figured, people who lived in one of the small villages scattered across this forested area. But it still felt unreal to see them disappear so quickly into what looked like an actual jungle. I took a few hesitant steps along the road, holding my phone in my hand like it was a flashlight, though the torch barely cut through the blackness. I saw some tiny specks of light far away. I thought it might be a cluster of houses, or maybe a small shop. I started walking toward it slowly, every rustle in the bushes making me flinch. I passed a bend and came closer to the lights, and that's when I realized it was a local bar. A small shack-like place with flickering tube lights, a few drunken voices echoing in the air, and the sharp smell of alcohol. Something about it made me stop in my tracks. I didn't feel safe going there alone at that hour. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I backed away slowly, deciding I'd rather wait out in the open and take my chances. I walked back a little toward where I had gotten off the bus, found a slightly elevated patch of ground, and stood there quietly, trying not to think about how things could go wrong. I was exhausted, scared, and unsure if I'd even get a bus back. I remembered reading somewhere that in certain regions, the last bus might not return if the day's route ended early. I tried to breathe evenly and focus. My phone showed 1 bar of signal, barely enough to open anything. No one knew where I was. I hadn't told anyone I was going to the beach. I hadn't shared my location. I hadn't even thought it would turn into something like this. I stared into the distance, eyes straining to catch any movement, ears tuned to every crackle, every insect chirp, every branch that moved in the wind. After what felt like a very long time, maybe 30-40 minutes, I saw a small cart lit by a dim lamp. A man was standing beside it, making omelets and serving them to a couple of people. I walked toward it slowly, cautiously. I still didn't feel safe, but I needed to do something. I asked him quietly if any buses would come back this way tonight, and after some hesitation, he told me that the same bus usually comes back, but not every day. He said if I was lucky, I'd see it again in the next 10 to 15 minutes. If not, I'd be stuck here until morning. I stood there next to his cart, trying not to move much, holding on to the hope that the bus would return. The minutes passed like hours. Then, finally, I heard the familiar sound of an engine, followed by the slow glow of headlights appearing from around the bend. I turned to look and felt an overwhelming wave of relief. It was the same bus, returning along its route. I almost laughed in disbelief. I got back on, found a seat near the front, and didn't let myself breathe easy until I saw the lights of the city again. By the time I reached my room, it was well past 10:30 at night. My feet were sore, my throat was dry, and I was mentally drained. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about how badly things could have gone. I had made a stupid decision without thinking it through, and it almost turned into something worse. Still, the sea had called to me, and despite everything, the feeling hadn't left. The next morning, I woke up early, packed my bags, and checked out. But I didn't head straight to the train station. Instead, I walked to the same bus stop, got on the right bus, and made my way to the beach. This time, it was early morning. The roads were quiet but safe, the air was cool, and the sky was turning from pink to gold. When I finally reached the shore, I stood there barefoot in the soft sand, the waves crashing gently in front of me. The beach was empty except for a few morning walkers and fishermen in the distance. I walked slowly along the edge of the water, feeling the foam wrap around my toes, the breeze brushing against my skin, and the sun rising behind me, casting long shadows on the sand. It was peaceful, beautiful, worth everything. I didn't stay long, just enough to imprint it in my memory. The sea that had almost gotten away from me. I caught a bus